Part 2. In which I examine whether there truly is, or even can be, any kind of freedom of will of the sort that Arminians claim lies at the very heart of liberty for all moral agents, and whether such a thing has ever existed or can even be imagined. Section 1. Demonstrating the clear inconsistency of the Arminian idea of liberty of the will, a notion that makes true freedom depend on the will's power to determine itself. Now, having carefully examined the key terms and phrases that come up in debates about human freedom, especially what liberty means in everyday speech, and what the Arminians mean by it, I turn now to their particular concept of the freedom of the will. I will consider the Arminian claim that this sort of freedom is absolutely necessary for moral agency, that is, that only with this liberty can someone truly be virtuous or vicious, and properly subject to command or counsel, worthy of praise or blame, and eligible for promises or threats, rewards or punishments. I intend to ask whether the everyday understanding of liberty, as previously described, is not only sufficient but the only kind of liberty that actually makes someone a moral agent and truly accountable. In this part, I will examine whether the Arminian kind of freedom of will, a self-determining power of the will, is even possible or conceivable. Then, in the next part, I will consider whether such liberty is necessary for moral responsibility, and so forth. To begin, I will examine the idea of a self-determining power within the will, which, according to Arminians, is the very essence of true freedom. I will especially ask whether it is not plainly unreasonable, and obviously inconsistent, to claim that the will itself is what determines all the free acts of the will. Here, I will not dwell on how improper it is to speak of the will determining itself, since actions should be ascribed to agents, not merely to the powers those agents possess. As Mr. Locke has noted, this careless way of speaking has led to many errors and much confusion. Still, I will assume that when Arminians talk about the will determining itself, what they really mean is the soul acting as it wills. I will take for granted that, when they say the will is the determiner, they are referring to the soul actually exercising its power to will, to act with intention and choice. I make this assumption because to mean anything else would be obviously and grossly absurd. Whenever we talk about powers or abilities to act, we mean that the agent who possesses these powers acts by using them. For example, when we say valor fights bravely, we mean that the person who is valor fights bravely. When we say love seeks the beloved, we mean that the one who loves seeks the object of love. When we say the understanding perceives, we mean the soul, using the faculty of understanding, perceives. So also, when we say the will decides or determines, it must mean that the person, through the exercise of willing and choosing, through voluntary action, makes the determination. Therefore, if the will determines all its own free acts, it means that the soul determines them by using its power to will and choose. In other words, it determines them by choice. The soul determines its own actions by choosing those actions. If the will determines the will, then every choice is governed and directed by another choice. Every act of choosing is subject to the guidance of a prior act of choosing. So, if the will determines all its own free acts, then every free act of choice must be decided by an earlier act of choice that selected it. And if that earlier act is also supposed to be free, then, by this reasoning, it too must be self-determined, that is, the soul voluntarily chose that act as well, and thus it would be determined by an even earlier act of will choosing it. This quickly leads us into a contradiction, for it requires there to be an act of the will that comes before the very first act in the entire sequence, directing and deciding all that follows, a free act before the first free act. Otherwise, we must eventually admit that there is some act of the will which determines the others, but is not itself self-determined, and therefore, according to this notion of freedom, is not free at all. But if the very first act in the sequence, the one that determines all the others, is not free, then none of the subsequent acts can be free either, as is obvious at a glance, though I will prove it further in a moment. If the will, which we observe to rule over the members of the body and direct their movements, also governs itself and determines its own actions, then surely it must do so in the same way, by prior acts of willing. The will decides which way the hands and feet will move by making a choice, and there is no other way for the will to determine, direct, or command anything at all. Whatever the will commands, it does so through an act of willing. So, if the will truly commands itself and directs its own actions, it must do this just as it commands anything else under its authority. Therefore, if the freedom of the will means that it holds itself and its own actions under its command, and if its choices are determined by itself, then every free choice must come from an earlier act of willing that directed it. And if that earlier act is also free, then that, too, must be determined by a previous act of will, and so forth, until we reach the very first act in the entire series. If that first act is also supposed to be free and self-determined, then it must, by the same reasoning, be determined by an act before it. But this is impossible, for by definition, the first act has nothing preceding it to direct or determine it, since it is the first. If that first act is not determined by a previous act of will, then it is not determined by the will at all, and thus is not free according to the Arminian definition of freedom, which demands self-determination. And if this first act of will, which sets the course for all following acts, is not free, then none of the acts that come after it, being determined by it, can be free either. For example, suppose there are 5 acts in a sequence, the 5th determined by the 4th by the 3rd by the 2nd, and the 2nd by the 1st. If the first act is not determined by the will and therefore not free, then none of the acts that follow are truly determined by the will. Each act is what it is, not because of the will itself, but because of the initial act, which was not determined by the will and which the will had no role in choosing. Since this first act decides what all the others will be and determines their very existence, the origin of the entire series is not found in the will. The situation is the same whether we imagine a chain of 5, 10, 100, or 10,000 acts of will. If the first act is not free, being determined by something outside the will, and this act determines the next, and the next, and so on, then none of the acts are free. Instead, every act in the chain depends on, and is determined by, something external to the will. Thus, all true freedom is eliminated, and no act of will can be free according to this view of freedom. Suppose we imagine a long chain of 10,000 links, each so connected that if the first link moves, it sets the next in motion, and that one moves the next, and so on. The entire chain's movement and the direction it takes are determined by the movement of the first link, which itself is moved by something outside the chain. In this scenario, even though all the links, except one, are set in motion by other links in the same chain, it is clear that none of them move or direct themselves by any self-moving or self-determining power within the chain. It is no different than if every link were moved directly by something entirely outside the chain. In the same way, if the will is not free in its first act, the act that causes the next, then it cannot be free in the following act, which is determined by that first act. For even though the will caused the second act, it did not do so freely, since the preceding act that brought it about was itself not free. Likewise, if the will is not free in the second act, neither can it be free in the third, which is caused by the second, for the third act is determined by an act of will that was not free. And this reasoning can be extended to every subsequent act, no matter how long the chain of actions may be. If the first act, on which the whole sequence depends and which determines all that follows, is not free, then the will is not free in producing or determining any of the following acts. The act by which all the others are determined is not a free act, therefore, the will is no more free in causing those acts than if it had not caused them at all. Thus, the Arminian idea of liberty of the will, freedom as self-determination, proves to be self-contradictory and utterly excludes itself from reality. Section 2. Examining various proposed ways of escaping the previous argument. If, in order to avoid the weight of what has just been said, someone were to argue that when Arminians speak of the will determining its own acts, they do not mean that the will determines them through any previous act, or that one act of will determines another. Instead, they might claim that the faculty or power of the will, or the soul using that power, simply determines its own choices, and does so without any act occurring before the chosen act. Such an attempt to escape the argument is utterly absurd. I admit, this is an evasion I have invented myself, and I do not know whether any Arminian has actually tried to use it. Yet, since it is as plausible an answer as any I can imagine, let me point out a few things about it. First, if the power of the will determines an act of volition, or if the soul, using or exercising that power, determines it, that is really the same as saying the soul determines a choice by an act of will. For to exercise the power of will is itself to perform an act of that power. Therefore, to say that the power of the will, or the soul exercising it, determines a choice without any preceding act of will, is a contradiction. Second, if the power of will determines an act of the will, then it is actually the power of choosing that determines it. As already noted, every act of will is an act of choice, and the power of willing is simply the power of choosing. But if a power of choosing determines a choice, it does so by choosing it. It is utterly unreasonable to say that a power of choice can determine one thing rather than another without actually choosing anything. But if the power of choice determines volition by choosing it, then the act of choosing is determined by a prior choice, a choice that came before. Third, to claim that the faculty, or the soul, determines its own volition without any act is also a contradiction. For when the soul directs, decides, or determines anything, it is acting, and this is exactly what is being discussed here. the soul is described as the cause, as the one doing something, or in other words, exerting itself in order to bring about an effect, namely, the determination of a particular act of will. But clearly, the action that produces this effect cannot be identical with the effect itself, rather, it must come before it. Those who defend this idea of the will's freedom speak of a certain sovereignty or authority within the will, by which it has the power to determine its own choices. If that is true, then the act of determining a volition must itself be an act of the will, otherwise, it could not truly be an exercise of such power and sovereignty. Furthermore, if the will determines itself, then either it is active in this determination, or it is not. If it is active, then the determination is an act of the will, meaning that one act of will is determining another. But if the will is not active in determining itself, then how can it be said to exercise any liberty in this matter? These writers insist that the will's liberty is exercised specifically in determining its own acts. But how can liberty be exercised if the will is not actually active in that determination? Surely, the will, or the soul, cannot display any freedom in a matter where it does not act or exert itself. So, whichever way you turn, this idea of liberty as a self-determining power collapses. If the will determines all its own free acts by some act of will, then one free act is always determined by a prior free act, and we are forced into the absurdity of saying even the first free act is determined by another that came before it. But if there is no act or exercise of will in determining its own acts, then there is no liberty exercised at all. Therefore, it follows that liberty does not consist in the will's supposed power to determine its own acts, or, in other words, there is no such thing as liberty being found in the will's self-determining power. If someone objects and says that, although it is true that if the soul determines its own choices, it must be active in doing so, and that this determination itself must be an act, yet it is not necessary to suppose that this act comes before the choice it determines. Instead, they might argue that the will, or the soul, determines the act of willing as it wills. It determines its own choice in the very moment of choosing, shaping and directing the act of will as it is being carried out, without any prior act needed to make it happen. If anyone speaks in this way, they must mean one of three things. 1. Either that the determining act, while coming before the chosen act in the order of nature, is not actually before it in time. Or 2. That the determining act is not prior to the chosen act in time or in nature, nor is it really distinct from it, but rather the soul's act of determining the choice is the very same thing as its making the choice. The mind's producing a particular act is itself the cause and determination of the act. Or 3. That a choice has no cause and is not an effect at all, but simply comes into being with a particular direction, without any reason or explanation for its existence or its determination. I will address each of these possibilities in turn. 1. If the only claim is that the determining act is not prior to the act determined in terms of time, this does nothing to resolve the problem, even if we grant it. If the determining act comes before the chosen act in the order of nature, meaning it is the cause or reason for its existence, then this alone shows it to be distinct from and independent of the act it determines, just as much as if it were earlier in time. For example, the cause of a physical object moving in a certain direction may occur at the very same moment as the movement itself, yet it cannot be identical with the movement. It must be as separate from its effect as any cause that comes before its effect in time, just as an architect is distinct from the house he builds, or a father is distinct from the son he begets. So, if the will's act of determining is truly distinct from the act it determines, and comes before it in the order of nature, then we can trace each act back to the one before, until we reach the very first act in the sequence. This first act has no prior act of the will to determine it in the order of nature, and so it is not determined by the will, which means, by this idea of freedom, it is not a free act. Yet this first act is the one that determines all that follow, so none of them can be free acts either. To illustrate, think of a long chain where only the first link is pulled by hand, all the other links move at once, with no time between their motions. Still, the movement of each link is prior in the order of nature to the link after it, the last is moved by the next, and so on, until the first, which is moved not by another link but by something entirely separate from the chain. This proves just as much that no part is moved by any self-moving power within the chain, as if each link's motion followed the other in time. 2. If anyone argues that the determining act is not prior to the act it determines, neither in time nor in the order of nature, and that it is not even distinct from it, but rather that the very exertion of the act is itself its determination, that is, for the soul to perform a particular volition is simply for it to cause and determine that act, then it seems the real issue is being ignored or hidden behind obscure language, unless, perhaps, the objector is contradicting themselves. Of course, the act of willing is itself a determination of the mind. It is the mind's coming to a conclusion, or making a choice between two or more options. But choosing among external objects is not the same as determining the act of choosing itself, among various possible acts of choice. The real question is this: what influences, directs, or determines the mind or the will to arrive at the particular conclusion or choice it does? What is the cause, reason, or ground for the mind deciding this way and not another? According to the Arminian view of freedom, the answer must be that the will itself influences, directs, and determines its own act. And if that is the case, I insist, it must do so by some prior act. To say that an act is caused, influenced, and determined by something, and yet not determined by anything prior, in time or in nature, is a contradiction. For by prior in the order of nature we mean that it is in some sense the cause or reason for the effect in question. If the particular act or effort of will that comes into being is truly determined at all, then there must be some cause for its existence, and for its specific character, some cause whose influence makes the difference. That cause must be distinct from, and prior to, its effect. But to say that the will or mind orders, influences, and determines itself to act simply by the very act of willing, is to make the same action both cause and effect, in other words, to claim that the act of exertion is the cause of the act of exertion. But the question at hand is, what is the cause and reason for the soul's performing a particular act? If the answer is, the soul performs this act, and that is the cause of it, then the act must somehow be distinct from itself and prior to itself in the order of nature, which is absurd. 3. If the claim is that the soul's exertion of a particular act of will simply happens on its own, without any cause, that there is absolutely no reason why the soul is determined to make one choice rather than another, then I say that, if this is what Arminians really mean when they argue so passionately for the will determining its own acts and for liberty as self-determining power, they are only confusing themselves and others with meaningless words. In the debate over what determines the will, and in the reply that the will determines itself, it is assumed throughout that something does in fact determine the will. The real controversy is not whether the will's determination has any cause or foundation at all, but whether the foundation is within the will itself or elsewhere. But if what is actually meant is that nothing at all determines the will, that a volition has no cause or ground for its existence, either within or outside the will, then the whole discussion falls apart. There is much talk of self-determining power as the source of all free acts of the will, but when pressed to explain, the answer turns out to be that there is no source at all for these acts, neither self-determining power nor anything else. They simply come out of nowhere, no cause, no power, no influence is involved at all. Nevertheless, this very idea, that the free acts of the will are events that occur without any cause, is actually implied by the Arminian view of liberty, even though it stands in clear conflict with other parts of their system, and even with some elements in their own definition of liberty. Their teaching suggests that each specific act of will has no cause, because they maintain that free acts of the will are contingent events, and in their understanding, contingency is essential to true freedom. But surely, anything that has a prior ground or reason for its particular existence, a cause that determines it beforehand, and determines it to be exactly as it is, cannot be called contingent. If something prior, by its influence and connection, determines exactly when and how such an act will occur, then it is no longer left to chance whether it will happen or not. And because this question, whether the free acts of the will are events that come to pass without a cause, is so important to this entire debate, I will examine it carefully in the next two sections. Section 3. Whether any event, especially an act of will, can ever occur without any cause for its existence. Before I begin my arguments on this subject, I want to clarify how I will use the word cause in this discussion. I do this because, lacking a better word, I must use cause in a broader sense than it is sometimes given. Often, cause is taken in a very narrow sense to mean only that which has a direct, positive power or influence to bring something about. But there are many things that do not have such active, productive power, and yet are still causes in that they serve as the real reason why certain things happen, or why things are one way rather than another. For example, the absence of the sun at night is not the cause of dew falling in the same sense that the sun's beams are the cause of vapors rising during the day, nor is the sun's withdrawal in winter the cause of water freezing in the same way that its approach in spring causes the thaw. Yet the sun's absence or withdrawal is an earlier condition, connected with these effects in night and winter, on which they depend, and it forms part of the ground and reason why these effects happen at those times and not at others, even though the absence itself is not something positive or directly influential. It is also important to note that, when I speak of the connection between causes and effects, I include both moral causes and what are typically called natural causes. Moral causes are just as much causes in the true sense as any natural causes. They can have real influence and can truly be the reason or ground for an event occurring. Therefore, in this discussion, I sometimes use cause to mean any prior condition, whether natural or moral, positive or negative, on which an event depends, whether it is the event itself, its manner, or its circumstances. Such a cause is what forms the ground or reason, in whole or in part, for why something happens rather than not, or why it happens in one way rather than another. In other words, I use cause for anything that precedes an event in such a way that it belongs to the reason why the statement about that event is true, regardless of whether it has a direct, positive influence. Similarly, I sometimes use effect for the result of something that may be more of an occasion than a strict cause. I am careful to explain my meaning this way so that no one may seize on my words as an excuse to nitpick or object to what I will say about the dependence of all things that happen on some cause, and about their connection to their causes. Now that I have explained what I mean by cause, I affirm that nothing ever comes into existence without a cause. Only what is self-existent is eternal and unchangeable, but everything that begins to exist is not self-existent, and therefore must have some foundation for its existence outside of itself. That whatever begins to be, which once was not, must have a cause for its beginning seems to be the most basic principle of natural, common sense, which God has planted in the minds of all people. It is the chief foundation for all our reasoning about the existence of things, whether past, present, or future. This basic sense applies not just to the existence of things themselves, substances, but also to their properties, conditions, and circumstances, modes. For example, if we see an object that has always been at rest suddenly begin to move, we instinctively and necessarily assume there must be some cause or reason for this new way of existing, just as we would if the object itself had suddenly come into being. Likewise, if an object that had been moving in one direction suddenly changes course, or if it alters its shape or color, the beginning of these new characteristics is itself a new event, and the human mind naturally supposes there must be a cause or reason for them. If this fundamental principle of common sense is denied, then all reasoning from effects to causes collapses, and so does all knowledge of anything beyond what we experience in the most direct and immediate way. In particular, all our proof for the existence of God disappears, for we argue for God's existence from our own existence, and the existence of other things we know once did not exist but began to be, and from the existence of the world and all its parts, and the way they exist, all of which are plainly not necessary in themselves, and therefore are not self-existent, and must have a cause. But if things that are not necessary in themselves can begin to exist without a cause, then all such reasoning is meaningless. To be clear, I do not claim that there is no foundation in the nature of things for knowing that God exists apart from evidence in his works. I do believe it would be utterly absurd to deny being altogether and to imagine an eternal, absolute, universal nothingness. For this reason, there is, in the very nature of things, a basis for intuitively knowing that there must be an eternal, infinite, most perfect being, if only we had minds strong and broad enough to grasp clearly the idea of universal existence. But in that case, our knowledge of God would not come by reasoning or argument, our evidence would be direct and intuitive. We would perceive his existence as plainly as we see that 2 + 2 = 4, or that a circle has no angles. If we could see universal and infinite being as clearly as we see these simple truths, I believe we would immediately and intuitively recognize the impossibility of such a being not existing. The very question of whether being could fail to be would make no sense. But our minds are not strong or comprehensive enough to know this with absolute certainty in such an intuitive and independent manner. Instead, the way that people come to know that God exists is the way described by the Apostle Paul in Romans 1:20. The invisible things of him, from the creation of the world, are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. We begin by reasoning a posteriori, that is, from effects to their cause, proving that there must be an eternal cause. Next, we argue, not by intuition, but by logical reasoning, that this being must necessarily exist. And then, having established the necessity of his existence, we can reason a priori to prove many of his perfections. But if we ever give up this foundational principle of common sense, that whatever is not necessary in itself must have a cause, and instead claim that things which never existed before can come into being on their own, without any cause, then all our reasoning from creation to creator is destroyed at a stroke. In that case, we would have no way to prove God's existence, neither from the existence of the world and the things in it, nor from their order, beauty, and usefulness. For if things can come into existence without any cause whatsoever, then they could also arise without any cause adequate to their nature or complexity. Our minds naturally and instinctively assume both of these things, First, that whatever begins to exist must have a cause, and second, that the cause must be proportionate to the effect. The same principle that tells us nothing can happen without a cause also tells us that the effect cannot be greater than the cause. In fact, if we once admit that things may happen without any cause at all, we would not only lose all proof for the existence of God, but we would lose all evidence for the existence of anything other than our own immediate sensations and consciousness. For we have no way to prove the existence of anything else except by reasoning from effects to causes. From the ideas that we experience directly, we infer the existence of other things not immediately before us. From our current sensations, we infer things outside ourselves as their causes, and from the existence of those things, we reason to yet others upon which they depend, as effects depend on causes. Even our memory of the past is only valid because we reason that the ideas now in our minds are the results of previous thoughts and sensations. In reality, we directly perceive only the ideas present in our minds at this very moment. All knowledge of anything else depends on these, and on their necessary connection to other things. But if things can exist without causes, all this necessary connection and dependence vanishes, and every means of knowing anything is destroyed. If there is no absurdity in supposing that a single thing could spring from nothing into being without a cause, then there is no more absurdity in supposing that millions upon millions of things could do the same. For nothing, multiplied any number of times, is still nothing. A difficulty multiplied does not make it any greater. Indeed, under the very view I am opposing, that the acts of the will come to pass without a cause, it would follow that, in fact, countless millions of events are constantly coming into existence by pure chance, without any cause or reason for their occurrence, all around the world, every day and hour, throughout all ages. This would be happening continually in every moral agent. This so-called contingency, this productive nothingness, this effective no cause, would always be ready to produce such effects, as long as the agent exists and whenever he chooses to act. But if it were truly the case that only one particular kind of thing, namely, acts of the will, seem to occur in this way, and that this happen regularly, wherever there are beings capable of such events, then this very pattern would prove that there is actually some cause behind them, making such acts different from all other events. It would show that these acts do not, in fact, happen by pure chance. For true contingency is blind and makes no distinctions. It does not select only certain events. Nothingness has no power to choose. This no cause, which does not bring anything into being, cannot cause the things that do arise to be only of one particular kind and not others. For example, the fact that only one kind of matter, water, falls from the sky, and that it happens so regularly, so abundantly, and in all ages, proves there must be some cause or reason for rain, and that something besides blind chance is at work. If we were to imagine nothingness giving birth to things, that things came into existence without any cause or prior condition on which their existence, kind, or manner depends, and nothing to determine whether what comes into being should be a stone, a star, a beast, an angel, a human body or soul, or merely a new motion in matter, a new sensation, a new idea, or a new act of will, then surely, even if millions upon millions of things were constantly coming into being in this way, we would not expect them all to be of just one particular kind. We would not expect this to happen in all ages and for this specific kind of event to occur wherever it is possible, or whenever there is a subject capable of it, and to do so without fail whenever the occasion arises. If anyone thinks there is something special about this kind of event, so that it is possible for free acts of the will to come into existence without a cause, while other things cannot, and argues that volitions are so different from other things that they do not need any previous ground or reason, then such a claim actually contradicts itself. They would be offering a reason for the existence of something, while insisting at the same time that there is no reason for its existence. Let me make it clear, no matter how unique or distinct the nature of something may be, that alone cannot explain its coming into existence without a cause. To believe otherwise would be to suppose that the particular nature of something exists before the thing itself does, making way for its existence without any cause or reason at all. But whatever, in any sense, prepares the way for a thing to come into being, or for the way and manner of its existence, must come before that thing exists. The unique nature of the effect, which belongs to the effect itself, cannot act backward and influence its own coming into being before it exists. The special character of what we call volition cannot do anything, nor have any influence, while it does not yet exist. And after it exists, it is too late for it to have any influence, since the thing already is, and did not need its own help to exist. Therefore, it is just as unreasonable to suppose that an act of the will could come into being without a cause as it would be to suppose that a human soul, an angel, the earth, or even the entire universe could come into being without a cause. And if we once allow that any effect, such as a volition, may come to pass without a cause, what prevents us from believing that all sorts of effects could do the same? The absurdity does not come from the particular kind of effect we are discussing, but from the fact that all things which begin to exist have this in common: they are not self-existent or necessary by their very nature. Section 4. Whether an act of will can arise without a cause, simply by the soul's own activity or nature. The author of the essay on the freedom of the will in God and the creatures, when faced with the objection to his teaching about a self-determining power in the will, that nothing happens without a sufficient reason for why it is, and why it is the way it is rather than otherwise, admits that this principle holds true for material things, which, in a strict philosophical sense, are passive. But he denies that it holds for spirits, which he describes as active beings who have the source of action within themselves and can determine themselves. This plainly means he is asserting that an act of will in a spirit can come to pass without any sufficient reason for why it happens, or why it happens this way instead of another. But surely, this author is not being careful or consistent in his reasoning here. 1. The very objection he raised seems to have been forgotten in his answer. As he himself stated it, the real difficulty is this: how can any event come to pass without a sufficient reason why it is, or why it takes one form rather than another? Instead of addressing this with regard to an act of will, as he claims to do, he shifts to another, quite different question: what is the sufficient reason why it is, and why it is this way rather than another? He simply assigns the soul's own determination as the cause, calling it a sufficient cause for the effect, but does not answer the real difficulty, namely, how the soul's own determination comes to exist, and why it is as it is, without a cause. The soul's active nature may allow it to cause effects, but it does not allow it to be the subject of effects that themselves have no cause, yet this is exactly what the author is supposing about acts of will. The soul's activity does not enable it to bring about effects within itself without any cause, any more than it could produce effects outside itself without a cause. If an active being were, by its own power, to cause and determine some effect in an external object, it would be absurd to say the effect happened without a cause. 2. The real question is not simply how a spirit, possessing the power to act, comes to perform actions, but rather why it performs this specific action and not another, why it acts with this particular direction or determination. If the soul's active nature is the reason why it acts at all, instead of remaining inactive, that still does not explain why its action takes this or that specific form, or why it is directed and limited in just this way. An active nature is something general. It is an overall ability or tendency to act, which might explain why the soul acts whenever there is some occasion or reason. But this alone cannot be a sufficient cause for why the soul chooses this particular action at this particular moment rather than some other. For that, there must be more than just a general tendency to action. There must also be a specific tendency toward that individual act. If someone were to ask, why does the soul use its activity in this way? And the reply was, because it has activity, would any rational person find that answer satisfying? Would it not be considered entirely beside the point? 3. An active being cannot bring anything about by its activity except what follows as a result of actually acting. Nothing is produced by mere dormant or unused activity, only the exercise of activity brings about results, and those results are the fruit of its actual use. The exercise of activity is action itself, so action, or the exercise of activity, must always come before the effects produced by it. If an active being causes something to happen in another being, if its activity affects something outside itself, the result is a consequence of its activity, and so the activity must be exercised first, and the effect must follow. The same holds true if the active being acts upon itself, causing or determining some effect within itself. The exercise of activity must come before the effect that is produced. Therefore, activity cannot be the cause of the determination of the very first action or exercise of activity itself, from which all further effects arise. That would be a contradiction. It would mean that the first exercise of activity is prior to itself and is the cause of itself. 4. Even though the soul is an active being, it cannot produce different actions except by actually acting first. It cannot be the determining cause of various actions or effects, sometimes one kind, sometimes another, except by carrying out those different acts. This is clear because, if it were otherwise, then the same cause, with no change whatsoever, would produce different effects at different times. That is, the substance of the soul before it acts, and its active nature before it is exercised, that is, before any action occurs in the order of nature, would be the cause of different effects, different choices or volitions, at different times. But the soul's substance before it acts, and its active nature before it is exercised, do not change, they are always the same. It is only some actual act that introduces the first variation in the cause, in terms of any actual exertion or influence. If the soul does not exercise a different kind of causality or a diverse causal influence in producing these different effects, then it is clear that the soul itself does not contribute to the diversity of the effects. The difference in effect cannot be attributed to anything in the soul itself. In other words, the soul does not determine the diversity of the effects. This contradicts the original assumption. It is true that, before acting, the soul's substance may exist in different states or circumstances. But those whom I am opposing will not allow that the soul's circumstances are the determining cause of its acts of will, since that would conflict with their notion of self-determination. 5. Let us assume, as these theologians do, that the only true acts of the soul are free choices or volitions. In that case, the soul is active only to the extent that it is voluntary and able to choose. Whenever it produces effects as an active being, it does so by making choices. But to produce effects in this way is the same as producing them as a result of, and in accordance with, its own choices. If that is true, then the soul does not produce all its own acts of will or choice by its activity, because, by definition, that would mean it produces all its free choices voluntarily and electively, that is, as a result of its own prior free choices. But this leads directly back to the contradiction already discussed. It would require a free act of choice before the very first free act of choice. According to the very definition these writers use, if a volition arises in the mind without being produced by a free act of will, then the mind is not the voluntary cause of that volition, because it did not arise from any choice or intention. Therefore, the mind cannot be the active, voluntary, determining cause of its first and primary act of will. The mind's ability to act with design allows it to produce effects in line with its purposes, but it cannot be the designing cause of all its own designs. The mind's power to choose enables it to produce effects that follow from its choices, but it cannot be the source of all its own choices, since that would require a choice before the first choice. In the same way, the mind's activity enables it to produce effects in consequence of its own acts, but it cannot be the determining cause of all its own acts. That, too, is a contradiction, for it would mean that a prior act determines the very first act, giving it existence and form. I cannot imagine that anything else is meant by saying the soul has the power to cause and determine its own choices, as a being to whom God has granted the ability to act, except this, that God has given the soul, at least at times, the ability to bring about acts of will whenever it pleases, or according to its own choice. But this clearly implies that, in every such instance, there is a choice that comes before every volition produced in this way, even before the very first one. And this leads directly to the fundamental contradiction already described. Therefore, the soul's active nature provides no escape from the problems surrounding the idea of a self-determining will. It does nothing to resolve the absurdities and inconsistencies that accompany this notion. Section 5. Demonstrating that, even if the claims made in these evasions were granted, they are entirely irrelevant and do nothing to support the case for Arminian liberty. Moreover, with the argument standing as it does, Arminian writers are left with no choice but to speak inconsistently. What was pointed out in the previous section shows not only that the soul's active nature cannot explain why a particular act of will takes place, or why it happens in this way rather than another, but also that, even if it could be proven that acts of will are truly contingent, with their existence and manner undetermined by any prior cause, this would do nothing to help the Arminian position. For Arminians define freedom as the will's power to determine itself, which assumes that every free act of will is determined by a prior act of will. For the will to determine something is simply for the soul to determine something by willing it, and the only way the will can determine an act of will is by choosing that act. This requires two acts of will, one preceding and choosing the other, the second act being the object of the first. If the will does not determine an act by choice, then it does not determine it at all, for anything not determined by choice is not determined voluntarily. And to say that the will determines something the soul does not choose willingly is to say that something is done by the will that the soul does not actually will. Therefore, if Arminian liberty, which is supposed to be the will's power to determine its own acts, is to be maintained, then the old contradiction returns. Every free act of will must be caused and determined by a previous free act of will. But this is not compatible with the idea that free acts arise without a cause and are so contingent that nothing prior fixes them. This so-called evasion must be abandoned, for it does not defend this view of liberty, it actually undermines and destroys it. Even if someone claims that the soul determines its own acts of will by some means other than a preceding act of will, this still does not help the Arminian argument. If the soul determines its acts by an act of the understanding or some other power, then the will is not determining itself, and so the supposed self-determining power of the will is lost. And according to their own definition of liberty, what freedom is exercised if the soul is determined by anything other than its own choice? The acts of the will might be directed or fixed, but they are not determined by the soul's own willing or choosing. If there is no act of will or choice in the matter, then how is there any liberty of will at all? No matter which way the Arminians turn with their notion of liberty, where the will is supposed to determine its own acts, their idea defeats itself. If they say that every free act of the will is determined by the soul's own free choice, or by a previous free act of will, whether earlier in time or in the order of nature, this leads to the obvious contradiction that the very first free act in the chain is determined by an act that comes before it. If, instead, they claim that free acts of the will are determined by some other act of the soul that is not an act of will or choice, this also destroys their doctrine of liberty as consisting in the will's determination of itself. Or if they maintain that the acts of the will are not determined by anything prior at all, but are so contingent that they are fixed by no cause, then this too destroys their idea of liberty as self-determination by the will. Given this is the true state of the Arminian view of liberty, its defenders are inevitably forced into glaring inconsistencies when they write on this subject. Take Dr. Whitby as an example. In his discussion of freedom of the will, he opposes the Calvinist view, which places human liberty solely in the power to do as one wills, saying that on this point Calvinists plainly agree with Hobbes. Yet Whitby himself describes this very idea as the teaching of common sense and a principle established by natural reason, that liberty is a power of acting from ourselves, or doing what we will. As he admits, this is in fact what agrees with the sense and common reason of mankind, and so it is not surprising that he sometimes acknowledges this, even against his own system. For if liberty does not consist in this, what else could it possibly be? If it is said, as Dr. Whitby argues elsewhere, that liberty consists not only in doing as we will, but also in willing without necessity, the question simply returns, what does it mean to have liberty of willing without necessity, except to have the power to will as we please, without being forced by any opposing necessity, in other words, to have the liberty for the soul, when willing, to act according to its own choice. In fact, this is exactly what Dr. Whitby himself seems to concede repeatedly when he quotes the early church fathers to support his view. For example, he cites Origen, the soul acts by her own choice, and it is free for her to incline to whatever part she will. He also quotes Justin Martyr, the doctrine of the Christians is this, that nothing is done or suffered according to fate, but that every man does good or evil according to his own free choice. From Eusebius, if fate be established, philosophy and piety are overthrown. All these things depend not on the necessity imposed by the stars, but on meditation and exercise proceeding from our own free choice. And again, from Macarius, God, to preserve the liberty of man's will, allowed their bodies to die, so that it might be in their choice to turn to good or evil. Those who are led by the Holy Spirit are not bound by necessity, but have liberty to turn themselves, and do what they will in this life. So, in reality, Dr. Whitby ends up adopting the very idea of liberty that the Calvinists hold, an idea he condemns as agreeing with Mr. Hobbes, namely, that the soul acts by its own choice, that people do good or evil according to their own free choice, that their actions flow from their own free choice, that it is within their power to turn to good or evil, and that they do what they will. If men exercise this liberty in their acts of will themselves, it must mean that they perform acts of will according to their own free choice, or that their acts of will proceed from their choice. And if this is so, let each person consider whether this does not require a free choice to come before the act of will, or whether an act of choice does not precede the act of will that proceeds from it. If this is the case for every free act of will, let each person judge whether it does not follow that there must be a free choice before the very first free act of will in any given situation. And finally, let all decide whether, in this system, it is possible to avoid these absurdities. If liberty consists, as Dr. Whitby himself says, in a man doing what he wills, and a man exercises this liberty not only in outward actions but in the acts of will themselves, then, as far as liberty is exercised in the will, it means willing what he wills. If someone says this, it must mean one of two things. 1. Either that a man has power to will as he does will, simply because whatever he wills, and therefore he has the power to will whatever he already has the power to will. If this is what is meant, then all this debate about freedom of the will and self-determining power amounts to nothing at all. Everything comes down to the simple truth that a person does what he does, and is what he is, the most obvious and uncontroversial point imaginable. 2. Or, it means that a man has the power to will as he chooses to will, that is, by one act of choice, he can choose another, by an earlier act of will, he can choose a later act, and thus carry out his own choice. But if this is the meaning, it is only an evasion, fooling their opponents and contradicting their own reason. For the question remains, where does a man's liberty lie in that prior act of will which chose the next act? The answer, following the same logic, must be that his liberty here lies in willing as he wills, or as he chose, or in line with another act of choice before that. And so the question returns endlessly, and the same answer must be given endlessly. To support their opinion, there must be no beginning. Every free act of will would have to be chosen by a prior free act of will in every person's soul, without end or beginning. Section 6. On the question of the will's determination in situations where the mind regards the options as perfectly indifferent. A major argument for the idea of self-determining power is the supposed experience we all have of being able to determine our wills in cases where no overriding motive appears. In such situations, it is claimed, the will is faced with a choice between two or more options that are perfectly equal in the mind's view. The will itself is entirely indifferent. Yet we supposedly have no trouble making a choice. The will can instantly decide for one option by its own sovereign power, without being moved by any stronger reason or inducement. For example, the aforementioned author of the essay on the freedom of the will, pages 25 to 27, suggests that there are many situations in which the will is determined neither by present discomfort, nor by the greatest apparent good, nor by the last instruction of the understanding, nor by anything else, but only by itself, as a sovereign, self-determining power of the soul. The soul, in such cases, chooses one action or another for no other reason than that it wills it. For instance, he says, I can turn my face to the south or to the north, I can point with my finger upward or downward. And so, in some situations, the will determines itself in a very sovereign way, just because it wills, without any reason borrowed from the understanding. In this way, it reveals its own perfect power of choice, arising from within itself and free from any outside influence or restraint. Again, on pages 66, 70, 73, and 74, the author clearly claims that, in many cases, the will is determined by no motive whatsoever, and acts entirely without motive or reason for preferring one option over another. Here, I would make the following observations. 1. The very claim being made here is self-contradictory and undermines itself. The central idea in this argument is that, out of several options, the will actually chooses one over another at the very moment it is supposedly completely indifferent. But this amounts to saying that the mind has a preference at the same time that it has no preference at all. What cannot be meant is that the mind is indifferent before it makes a choice, or before it develops a preference, for surely no one disputes that. Moreover, the author's own words show that he does not mean the will chooses between things about which it was indifferent only before it chose. Rather, he insists that the will is still indifferent even as it makes its choice, and only afterwards ceases to be indifferent, as a result of having chosen. The thing chosen appears preferable and more agreeable than the alternative only because of the choice already made. He writes, page 30, where the objects proposed seem equally suitable or good, the will is left without a guide or director, and so it must decide by its own power, being truly a self-determining faculty. In such cases, the will, as it were, creates a good for itself by choosing it, that is, it creates its own pleasure or delight in this self-chosen good, just as a man who claims a piece of unoccupied land in an empty country makes it his own property and rejoices in it as such. Where things were indifferent before, the will finds nothing in them to make them more agreeable, in themselves, except for the pleasure it experiences from its own choice and the resolve to stick with it. We love many things we have chosen, purely because we have chosen them. This is essentially to say that we begin to prefer many things purely because we have already chosen them, a plainly careless assertion. A choice or preference cannot exist before itself, whether in time or in logical order. It cannot be its own foundation or result. The very act of choosing one thing over another is itself an act of preference, of setting greater value on that option. But for the mind to set a higher value on one thing is not, in the first place, the result of already having set a higher value on it. The author claims, page 36, the will may be perfectly indifferent, and yet the will may determine itself to choose one or the other. He repeats, I am entirely indifferent to either, and yet my will may determine itself to choose. And again, which I shall choose must be determined by the mere act of my will. But if the choice is determined by a mere act of will, then the choice is determined by a mere act of choosing. And the writer is quite explicit about this. On page 72, discussing cases where the options are equally fit, he says, there it must act by its own choice, and determine itself as it pleases. Here, the very determination that supposedly causes the act of will is itself an act of choosing, a matter of pleasure or preference, one act being more agreeable than another. If that is the case, then the mind is not indifferent when it determines itself. It would rather choose one way than another. Therefore, the will does not act in a state of indifference, not even at the very first step. Even if, in theory, the understanding could act in complete indifference, surely the will never does, because for the will to begin to act is for it to begin to choose or prefer. And if, in the very first act of will, the mind prefers something, then the idea of that thing must outweigh or prevail in the mind. In other words, it has a stronger influence on the will. So, the claim that the mind can, by a sovereign power, choose one of two or more things that are absolutely equal in every respect, none outweighing the other in the mind, completely falls apart. So, in making his main argument for the will's ability to choose among options about which it is supposedly perfectly indifferent, this author actually denies his own position. He ends up admitting, in effect, that the will, when it chooses, is not truly free from all prevailing influence related to what is chosen. In fact, it is impossible to present this argument without destroying it in the process, because what is assumed in the argument directly contradicts itself. To say the will acts in a state of perfect indifference is to claim that the mind chooses without making a choice. To say that, when the mind is indifferent, it can do as it pleases, is to say it can follow its own pleasure even when it has no pleasure to follow. Therefore, if there is any real difficulty in cases like choosing between 2 cakes or 2 eggs, which are exactly alike and equally desirable, and in which the author claims the mind actually makes a choice, which is really to say it has a preference, then he must address that difficulty as much as those he argues against. For if these examples prove anything for his view, they prove only that a person chooses without making a choice. And yet, that does not serve his case, for if that is what he is really claiming, then his own words contradict him just as much as those of his opponents. 2. It is not hard to show, in the sorts of examples that have been given, not only that the mind must necessarily be influenced in its choices by something that has a stronger pull on it, but also how this happens. If we pay a little attention to our own experience and carefully consider the way our minds actually work in such cases, the truth will become clear. Suppose, for example, that I have a chessboard in front of me. Perhaps I am asked by a superior, encouraged by a friend, or have some other reason to touch one of the squares with my finger. There is no requirement or guidance at the outset as to which square I should touch, and there is nothing in the nature of the 64 squares themselves that makes one more appealing than the others. In this case, my mind decides to leave the choice to what we commonly call chance by resolving to touch whichever square happens to be most in my field of vision at that moment, or whichever is most prominent in my thoughts, or whichever I am guided to by some similar accident. Even if this all happens in an instant, there are still several mental steps involved. First, the mind makes a general determination. It will touch one of the squares. Next, it resolves to leave the choice to chance, perhaps deciding to touch the square that is most visible or most present in the mind, or something similar. The final step is a particular determination to touch a specific square, the one that, by this accidental process, has come to stand out above the rest. In none of these steps does the mind act with perfect indifference. In each case, it is swayed by some motive or reason that prevails in the mind. In the first step, the decision to touch one of the 64 squares, the mind is not absolutely indifferent. It is drawn by a motive, perhaps a desire to carry out an experiment or the wish to please a friend, or some other reason that prevails. In the second step, the choice to leave it up to chance by touching whichever square is most visible or most present in the mind is not absolutely indifferent about this method. It chooses this approach because it seems convenient or necessary for fulfilling the initial purpose. In the third and final step, the choice of the particular square that stands out, the mind is again not indifferent, but is influenced by a prevailing reason, namely, that this is the fulfillment of the previous determination that seemed necessary and was fixed in the second step. In such situations, accident will always provide a person with a solution, and never delay him even for a moment. Out of the many objects in sight, one will inevitably stand out in our vision or imagination. When our eyes are open in bright sunlight, countless objects strike our eyes at the same time, and an endless number of images are painted on the retina by rays of light. Yet the mind's attention is not equally divided among all of them at once, or if it is, it never remains that way for more than an instant. The same is true of the mind's ideas in general. Several ideas are never of equal force or clarity in the mind's view at any one moment, or if they are, this state does not last for any perceptible time. Nothing in the world changes more constantly than the ideas within our minds. They do not remain precisely the same for even the briefest period. This is clear because we perceive the passage of time only by the continuous changes in our own thoughts. As long as the mind's perceptions remain exactly the same, no time is experienced, because there is no detectable change at all. Just as the will's actions, in each step described above, never happen without a particular cause, each act always being prompted by some prevailing motive, so too the accident, as I have called it, or that event which occurs within the mysterious flow of circumstances in which the mind yields to, is not something that comes about without a cause. When the mind decides to be guided by such an accident, it is not responding to something without a cause, any more than if it decided to be guided by the outcome of drawing lots or throwing dice. For although the result of a die roll is accidental to the one who throws it, no one would claim that there is no cause at all for how it lands. The involuntary changes in the succession of our ideas, even when their cause is not obvious, are as truly caused as the swirling motion of dust motes in the air or the endlessly shifting ripples on the surface of water. There are two main reasons, in particular, that likely lead people to confusion when they insist that the will acts in true indifference and without being moved by any motive in such cases. 1. Those who argue for the will's ability to act in perfect indifference seem to misunderstand the real issue, or at least do not keep it clearly in mind. The debate, as they present it, is whether the mind is indifferent about the objects set before it, such as 2 eggs or 2 cakes, both of which appear equally good. But the true question is whether a person is indifferent concerning his own actions, whether he does not, for one reason or another, prefer a particular act related to those objects. In these situations, the mind's determination and choice is not primarily about the objects themselves, but about what action to take regarding them. The objects may seem identical, and the mind may never actually make a real choice between them, yet the will's next move concerns the external action, taking, touching, and so forth, which may not seem equal, and for which one action may genuinely be chosen over another. At each stage of the mind's process, the choice is not about the objects, except perhaps indirectly, but about the actions, which are chosen for reasons unrelated to any preference between the objects themselves. There is no need to suppose the mind ever actually prefers one object over another, whether before or after the action. In reality, a person chooses to take or touch one thing rather than another not because he prefers the thing itself, but for reasons outside the nature of the objects. It is even possible that, for certain reasons, a man might choose to take the item he values less and pass over the one he prefers. In such a situation, choosing the thing itself and choosing to act upon it are not the same. The same is true when the things presented are equal in the mind's eyes, neither is preferred. What observation and experience actually prove is simply that the mind prefers one action over another. Therefore, if their arguments are to be relevant, they should seek to prove that the mind chooses an action in complete indifference regarding that action itself, not just indifference toward the object. It is entirely possible for someone to be indifferent to the object, yet the will never acts at all unless a prevailing reason or motive tilts the balance. 2. Another reason for confusion and difficulty in this discussion seems to be a failure to distinguish between general indifference, a lack of concern about what is to be done when considering it broadly and at a distance, and particular indifference, which concerns the immediate next action in its specific and present circumstances. A person may be completely indifferent about his actions in the first, general sense, yet not at all indifferent in the second, specific sense. For example, in the case of touching a square on a chessboard, when I am first asked to touch any square, I may be entirely indifferent about which one to touch, since at this stage I see the situation only in broad terms. This is just the first step in the mind's process. But by the time I reach the final step, where the immediate decision is which specific square to touch, I have already determined that I will touch the square most prominent to my eye or in my thoughts, and my mind is now focused on a particular square. At this point, the act of touching that specific square, considered in its immediate context, is no longer something I am completely indifferent about. Section 7. On the concept of liberty of the will understood as indifference. What has already been stated in the previous section helps to reveal the absurdity of the belief held by those who place liberty in indifference, or in the notion that the will is in perfect balance without any prior inclination, so that the decision of the will to go one way or another is entirely its own, and due only to its own power and sovereignty over itself. Yet, since this idea has persisted for so long, has been so widely accepted, and so strongly promoted by Pelagians, Semi-Pelagians, Jesuits, Socinians, Arminians, and others, it is worth giving the matter a fuller and more careful examination. I will therefore proceed to a more detailed and thorough investigation of this view. Now, to prevent anyone from thinking I misunderstand those who place liberty in indifference, or from accusing me of misrepresenting their position, I want to make it clear that I realize there are some who, when they speak of liberty of will as consisting in indifference, seem to mean not an indifference of inclination or tendency in the will, but rather an indifference in the soul's capacity or power to will, that is, that the will, when it comes to its ability to choose, is equally able to go either way, to the right or to the left, to act or not to act, just as easily one way as another. This refinement appears to be the invention of a few recent writers and does not fit the language generally used by those who defend the liberty of indifference. I wish such theorists would carefully consider whether they even understand their own meaning when they draw a distinction between the soul's indifference as to its power or ability to choose, and its indifference as to the preference or choice itself. They may be deceiving themselves in imagining that this distinction means anything at all. For the soul's indifference as to its ability or power to will is really the same as indifference in the state of the will's faculty, or the indifference in the soul itself, so far as it has that faculty, about whether it will exercise that power in its coming choice. But without dwelling any longer on the mysterious complexity of this distinction, let us set aside questions of meaning and simply say this. When Arminians speak of indifference as essential to the liberty of the will, if their words are to have any real significance, they must at least mean this, an indifference in which the will is not already determined, but remains free from any settled disposition and uncommitted, leaving room for the supposed self-determining power of the will to operate. According to this view, the will's freedom depends on there being an open, undetermined space in which the will itself can be the ultimate decider of its own free act. Now, it is important to notice, first of all, that for this understanding of liberty to make sense, this indifference must be total and absolute. There must be complete freedom from any prior preference or inclination. For if the will is already inclined in any way before it exercises its own supposed sovereign power, then its choice is not entirely the result of itself. If, when two opposite options are presented for the soul's choice, the mind is not found in a condition of perfect indifference, then it is not truly in a state of liberty for pure self-determination. Even the slightest hint of a previous bias would contradict their concept of liberty. For as long as the will is already influenced by some prior inclination that has not been removed, that previous inclination constrains the will so completely that it cannot act in any way except in line with that inclination. Certainly, the will cannot choose or act against a prevailing inclination that is still present. To suppose otherwise would be the same as saying that the will is inclined against its own current prevailing inclination, or chooses against what it is currently inclined to choose. Whatever the will prefers, that is where it leans, and it is just as impossible for the will to choose against its own current dominant inclination as it is to prefer something other than what it actually prefers, or to choose contrary to its own present choice. Therefore, as long as the will remains under the sway of an existing, dominant inclination, it is not free for a new, genuinely self-determined act. A truly self-determined free act must be one the will determines while in possession of a unique kind of liberty, a liberty consisting in complete freedom from anything that, if present, would make it impossible for the will to act in any way other than the direction in which it already leans. If anyone claims there is no need for perfect indifference, that even if a previous inclination remains, as long as it isn't very strong, perhaps the will's own strength can resist and overcome it, this is plainly absurd. No matter how great the supposed strength of the will, it cannot give itself such sovereignty that it can both prefer and not prefer at the same time, or choose against its own current choice. Therefore, even the slightest prior inclination must be entirely removed before the will can be free to determine itself in the opposite direction. And if the will chooses in the same direction as its existing inclination, then its determination is not truly free, for it is not entirely at liberty in that act. Its decision is not fully its own, but partly influenced by the prior inclination. In such a case, all the freedom the will exercises consists only in the extra degree of inclination it adds to what was already there. Part comes from itself, and part comes from the previous bias. Even if the will had a previous tendency in that direction, with respect to the new act, the only freedom lies in any new inclination the will gives itself beyond what it already possessed. So, the previous tendency is irrelevant when considering the act in which the will is free. Thus, it comes back to the same point. For any truly free act of the will, there must be perfect indifference or equilibrium at the start. To illustrate this, imagine a body with a sovereign self-moving power, but which is already moving because of some prior influence, like gravity pulling it toward the earth. Suppose gravity gives it 1 degree of motion, but through its self-moving power, it adds another degree, moving even faster toward the earth than gravity alone would allow. Clearly, in this case, only the extra degree of motion is due to the self-moving power. The initial degree came from gravity and does not count as self-motion. The effect is just as if the body had produced a single degree of motion out of a state of perfect rest. Or suppose a scale already outweighs the opposite side by 1 degree, if it can, by its own self-moving power, add another degree of force in the same direction, this is just the same as giving itself an extra degree of preponderance starting from perfect balance. Thus, the scale self-moving, self-preponderating power is always measured from perfect equilibrium. In every case, its true freedom or self-movement is only as much as it can move itself away from perfect balance. I need say nothing more to prove that, if indifference is essential to liberty, then it must be perfect indifference, and that wherever the will lacks this, it also lacks that freedom which makes it able to determine itself, instead of being passive or subject to the influence and control of something else in its movements and choices. Having established these points, let us now examine whether the idea that liberty of the will consists in indifference and equilibrium, and that the will can determine itself while in such a state, is not in fact absurd and self-contradictory. To begin, I will state this as a self-evident axiom: every free act is performed in a state of freedom, not merely after such a state. If an act of the will is truly free, it must be performed while the soul actually possesses freedom, at the very moment the act occurs. It is not enough that the act simply follows a state of liberty. Liberty must still be present and coexist with the act itself, the soul remaining in actual possession of freedom. This is what is meant by a free act of the soul, an act in which the soul makes use of or exercises its liberty. If, at the very time of the act, the soul no longer possesses liberty, then it cannot be making use of it at that moment. Now, the real question is this: does the soul of man ever exercise an act of will while it remains in a state of liberty understood as indifference? In other words, can the soul ever make a choice or express a preference while the will is, at that very moment, in perfect equilibrium, not leaning one way or the other? Simply asking this question reveals how absurd it would be to answer yes. For how could anyone seriously claim that the soul prefers one thing over another, while, at the very same moment, it is utterly indifferent between them? This is the same as saying the soul prefers one thing to another while having no preference at all. Choice and preference cannot exist in a state of indifference any more than motion can exist in a state of rest, or a scale can tip while remaining perfectly balanced. Motion might follow rest in the next instant, but it cannot coexist with rest, not even for the smallest fraction of time. In the same way, a choice may come immediately after indifference, but cannot exist at the same time as indifference. Even the very beginning of choice is no longer a state of indifference. Therefore, if liberty consists in indifference, then no act of the will is ever performed while the soul is actually free, for the very act of choosing ends the state of liberty as indifference. Volition and liberty, in this sense, are not only separate, but they are actually opposites. Each excludes and destroys the other, just as motion excludes rest, or light excludes darkness, or life excludes death. The will does not act at all, not even begin to act. While it is in this kind of liberty, freedom ceases to exist the very moment action begins. Thus, liberty cannot affect or qualify the action in any way, no more than if it had ended 20 years before the action took place. As soon as light is extinguished and darkness is complete, nothing can be called bright. As soon as life ends, nothing can be called living. Likewise, if freedom is the same as indifference, then nothing can be called free at the very moment preference appears. Therefore, it is clear that no liberty which the soul ever possesses or exercises in its acts of will consists in indifference, and the idea that indifference is essential to liberty is not just mistaken, but utterly self-contradictory and absurd. If anyone thinks this line of reasoning is just a trick or an evasion, and tries to escape its force by saying that the will's liberty is not exercised in the act of choosing or preferring itself, but rather in determining itself toward a certain choice or preference, that is, that the true act of freedom is the will causing or initiating the transition from indifference to preference, or in giving itself a certain tilt to the balance that was previously even, and that the will accomplishes this act while still in a state of liberty and equilibrium, with perfect mastery over itself, let us consider whether this really avoids the same absurdities as before. What is being asserted here is that the will, while still perfectly balanced and indifferent, decides to move itself out of that state, to give itself a definite preference. But does this not simply bring us back to the same contradiction? If it is claimed that the will, while still in perfect indifference, chooses to leave that state and to prefer one way, then I must ask, does the soul not do this by choice? Isn't the will's determination to do so the same as the soul's choosing to do so? If the soul does not make this determination by choice, if this is not done voluntarily, then it is not a free decision at all. And if the will does not determine this act, then how is liberty being exercised in the will? What sort of liberty is this, in which the soul determines but without any act of will, without any exercise of choice, without anything voluntary about it? But if we do say that this determination is itself a choice, and insists that the soul, while still perfectly indifferent, chooses to exit that state and turn one way, then we have already arrived at a choice. The soul has already chosen a direction. And so we return to the same absurdity as before. The soul is in a state of choosing and in a state of perfect equilibrium at the very same moment, choosing one way while supposedly being completely indifferent, having no preference one way or the other. In fact, this sort of talk, while it may hide the contradiction in vague or complex language, actually makes the inconsistency even worse. To say that the free act of the will, performed in a state of indifference, is not an act of preference but is what the will does to bring about a preference, is no different than saying that the soul chooses without choosing, or prefers without preference, in order to bring about the beginning of preference or the first choice. In other words, the first choice is made without a choice, so that it can cause itself to exist. If, in order to escape these conclusions, someone admits that a state of liberty and a state of indifference are not the same, and that liberty can exist without indifference, but still insists that indifference is essential to freedom because it must immediately precede it, arguing that an act of will is only free if it arises directly out of a state of indifference, this will not help the Arminian case or make their idea consistent. For if a free act springs straight out of a state of indifference, then it does not arise from any prior choice or preference. And if the act comes directly from indifference, with no intervening choice to guide it, then the act is not determined by the will at all. The mind makes no free choice in the matter, and free choice or free will plays no part in determining the act. This is completely at odds with their own definition of freedom of the will. Suppose, then, that someone tries to avoid these contradictions by saying that liberty consists in the mind's power to suspend its own acts of will, to hold itself in a state of indifference until it has had time to consider. In this view, indifference is not required in such a way that a choice must be made during a state of indifference, which is impossible, or that the act of will must arise immediately from indifference. Instead, indifference is said to be essential in this way. Liberty is a power to withhold or suspend volition, to keep the mind in a state of indifference for a time, so that there can be proper deliberation. If anyone imagines this solves the problem, they are greatly mistaken. It does not resolve the contradiction or solve any of the difficulties. The following things must be observed. 1. If there really is such a thing as suspending one's will, this suspension is itself an act of will. If the mind decides to hold off on making a choice, it does so voluntarily. It chooses, for some reason, to wait. This decision is itself an act of the will. Indeed, the very theory being discussed assumes this to be true, since it claims that the will's liberty consists in this very power to suspend, and that by doing so, the will exercises its freedom. But how can the will exercise liberty in something that is not an act of the will? The liberty of the will is not exercised in anything except what the will actually does. 2. This decision to suspend action is not only an act of will, but, according to the argument, it is supposed to be the only truly free act of the will, since the claim is that liberty is found precisely in this ability. If that is so, then this is the only act of the will we need to examine in this whole debate. And now, the earlier question comes back to us. Where, exactly, does the will's freedom lie in those acts in which it is said to be free? If this act of suspending is the only free act, then how does the will exercise its freedom regarding this suspension? And how is indifference essential to that act? According to the argument under consideration, the answer must be that liberty, even in the act of suspending, lies in the power to suspend even this decision, so that there is time for thorough deliberation. But this plunges us into outright nonsense. The act in question is the suspension itself. There is no space for further delay or deliberation in order to decide whether or not to suspend. For to defer the very act of suspending, to consider whether to suspend, is to suspend already, for in the time spent thinking about whether to suspend, one is in fact suspending. There is no middle ground between suspending and acting immediately, and therefore no way to avoid doing one or the other even for a single moment. Furthermore, this view leads to another obvious absurdity. Now it seems that liberty consists entirely in the mind's ability to suspend its decision about whether to suspend, in order to allow time for considering whether suspension is best. If liberty is found only here, then this is the liberty we must now examine. We are forced to ask, how does liberty with respect to suspending a decision about suspension depend on indifference, or how is indifference essential to it? According to the current hypothesis, the answer must be that liberty here consists in the power to suspend even this decision, so that there is more time to consider whether to suspend that as well. And so the same difficulty returns all over again, and again without end. This would prove, if anything, that there is no such thing as a free act at all. It pushes the exercise of freedom back infinitely, which is simply to remove it from reality altogether. But beyond this, there is another hidden contradiction in the argument. In trying to explain how the will is free regarding a particular act of volition, it is said that liberty consists in the power to decide to suspend that act. This shifts liberty away from the act of will in question and places it in a prior act instead, directly contradicting both the question and the answer. The question is, where does the mind's liberty lie in any specific act of volition? The answer, instead of showing where liberty is in that act, actually claims it is not in that act at all, but in some earlier act, a decision to suspend the original act and take more time to consider it. The answer therefore contradicts itself and completely misses the point, because it does not explain where liberty lies in the act under discussion. It simply moves the problem to another act, a choice to suspend, without giving any account of how the mind is free with respect to that second act, in which it now claims liberty actually resides. In the end, it is exceedingly clear that the liberty of the mind does not consist in indifference, and that indifference is neither essential nor even relevant to liberty, as the Arminians claim. Their opinion is filled with nothing but self-contradiction. Section 8. On the supposed liberty of the will, as opposed to all necessity. The main point Arminians insist upon in this debate, and what they see as most vital to true human liberty, is that acts of will, or volitions, are contingent events. By contingent, they mean not merely free from coercion or external force, but also free from any kind of necessity, even the necessity of consequence, that is, they are not bound by any unbreakable connection to what came before. Because of the importance of this claim, I will consider it in detail. First, I want to ask, is it possible for any act of will to be contingent in this sense, not only free from the necessity of constraint, but also free from any necessity of consequence, so that it is not infallibly connected to anything that came before? Second, if such a thing were possible, would it actually provide any meaningful help for the idea of liberty? 1. Let us first examine whether an act of will can ever truly be contingent in this way. We must remember, as already established, that nothing ever happens without a cause or a reason why it exists in one way rather than another, and this has already been shown to apply to the acts of the will. If this is true, then it necessarily follows that the acts of the will can never be truly contingent or without necessity in the sense Arminians intend. Things that have a cause or reason for their existence must, by definition, be connected to their cause. This can be seen for several reasons. 1. For an event to have a cause or reason for its existence, and yet not be connected to that cause, is a contradiction. If the event is not connected to the cause, then it does not depend on it at all, its existence is loose from the cause's influence, and may or may not follow the cause. In other words, it is left to chance whether it follows the cause or not. But that is the same as saying it does not depend on the cause. To say that an event does not depend on its cause is absurd. It is the same as saying that the supposed cause is not really its cause, and the event is not really its effect. Dependence on the influence of a cause is what it means to be an effect. If there is no real connection or dependence between one thing and another, then there is no real relation of cause and effect at all. The degree to which an event is dependent and connected to a cause is the degree to which the cause actually produces the effect, and no more. If someone says the connection and dependence is only partial, not total, then what they really mean is that only part of the event comes from that cause, and the rest must come from something else. 2. If there are events that are not necessarily connected with their causes, then it follows that some things must happen without any cause at all, which contradicts the very idea of causality. For if an event is not necessarily connected to the influence of its supposed cause under certain circumstances, then whether the event happens or not is left to chance. It could happen, or it might not, even though the cause and all its circumstances remain exactly the same. So why did it happen in one case and not in another? There can be no cause or reason for this difference. Thus, there is something, the effect following from the cause, without any cause or reason at all for its occurrence. If there is no necessary connection between any effect and what comes before it, then we must admit that sometimes the event follows its cause, and sometimes it does not, even when the cause is entirely unchanged. What explains this strange diversity, that in one case the effect appears, and in another it does not? According to the argument, it has no cause at all. This means there is something in the present state of the world that is entirely without a cause, which is both contrary to the idea of causality and to what has already been demonstrated. 3. To suppose that some events have a cause and yet are not necessarily connected to it is to claim, in effect, that they have a cause which is not their real cause. Here is why. If the effect is not necessarily connected with the cause, with its influence, and with all the circumstances that should influence it, then it is possible that the cause could exert the same influence in exactly the same circumstances, and yet, sometimes, the effect does not occur. If this actually happens in any instance, then that instance shows that the cause's influence was not sufficient to produce the effect, because if it were truly sufficient, the effect would always follow. Yet, by this reasoning, in another instance, the same cause and influence, under exactly the same circumstances, does produce the effect. Clearly, then, the effect in this latter case was not actually produced by the cause, since it was previously shown that the cause's influence was not sufficient. If the cause's influence is not sufficient, the production of the effect cannot be attributed to it, but must have come from somewhere else, or from nothing at all. If the effect does not truly depend on the cause's influence, then the supposed cause is not a cause at all. This leads us into a contradiction. Something is claimed to be both the reason for a thing's existence and, at the same time, not the reason for its existence. If the matter is not already clear enough, making further argument unnecessary, I would add this: in the situation just described, what is supposed to be the cause cannot actually be a cause at all, since its power and influence, when truly tested, have proven insufficient to produce the effect. If it is not sufficient to produce the effect, then it does not in fact produce it. To claim otherwise is to say there is a power to do what there is not actually power to do. If a cause, with sufficient power and in the right circumstances, brings about an effect at one time, then that same cause, in the same circumstances, must always produce the same effect. Conversely, if the effect does not occur in one instance, then the cause cannot be considered sufficient in another, so long as all influential circumstances are identical. Therefore, if the effect does happen, it cannot be due to that cause, unless the difference in time itself is a relevant circumstance. But this would contradict the assumption that all circumstances of influence are the same. And besides, this would make time itself the cause, which is not what is supposed. But if a mere difference in time has no effect, then it is just as absurd to say that a cause was sufficient at one time but not at another, as it is to say that it is sufficient to produce an effect at a given moment, and yet not sufficient at that same moment. In summary, it is entirely clear that every effect must be necessarily connected to its cause, or to whatever is the real ground and reason for its existence. Therefore, if every event must have a cause, as has already been shown, then no event can be contingent in the way Arminians suppose the free acts of the will to be contingent. Section 9. On the connection between the acts of the will and the dictates of the understanding. It is clear that no act of the will is contingent in the sense of being utterly without necessity, or of being free from any necessary connection, because every act of the will is, in some way, linked to the understanding. As previously explained, the will always chooses that which, in the present view of the mind, taking into account the entire perspective and all its elements, appears most agreeable. Nothing is more certain than this: when people act voluntarily and do as they please, they always do what seems most agreeable to them at that moment. To deny this is to claim that people do not choose what seems best to them, or that they do not select what they actually prefer, which is a contradiction. It is, then, both obvious and widely acknowledged that the acts of the will are connected to the views or dictates of the understanding. Even some of the leading Arminian writers admit this, such as Dr. Whitby and Drive Samuel Clarke. Dr. Turnbull, though strongly opposed to the doctrine of necessity, agrees as well. In his Christian Philosophy, page 196, he approvingly quotes another philosopher: "No man sets himself to do anything without some view, which gives him a reason for his actions, and whatever faculties he uses, the understanding, whether it is rightly or wrongly informed, always leads. By this light, whether true or false, all the operative powers are directed. The will itself, however absolute or uncontrollable it may seem, never fails to obey the dictates of the understanding. Temples have their sacred images, and we see what influence these images have always had over many people. But in reality, the ideas and images in people's minds are the invisible powers that truly govern them, and to these everyone universally submits. Yet, we must now honestly consider whether this admission is truly consistent with their own views about liberty. Dr. Whitby clearly believes that every act and decision of the will always follows the understanding's perception of what is the greatest good to gain, or the greatest evil to avoid. In other words, he teaches that the choices of the will inevitably and unfailingly correspond to two things within the understanding. 1. The measure of good to be attained, or evil to be avoided, as it is presented to and recognized by the understanding. 2. The intensity or degree to which the understanding perceives that good or evil, a perception that grows with focused attention and careful thought. That this is his unwavering position, as it is with every point he debates against the Calvinists, and that he treats any opposing view with scorn as both absurd and self-contradictory, is evident in his own words from his discourse on the 5 points. Now, it is certain that what naturally causes the understanding to perceive is the presence of evidence that is set before us, grasped, and thoughtfully considered. Nothing else is required for us to come to know the truth. Again, what makes the will choose is something that the understanding approves of, something that appears to the soul as good. Whatever the will refuses is something the understanding presents, and which therefore appears to the will as evil. Thus, all God asks of us is, and can only be, this, to reject evil and choose good. Therefore, to say that evidence which is presented, grasped, and considered is not enough to make the understanding approve, or that the greatest good or evil, when equally believed and considered, is not enough to move the will to choose the good and refuse the evil, is really to say that the very thing which alone moves the will to act is not enough to move it at all, which is a contradiction and therefore must be false. Even if we naturally resist the truths presented in the gospel, that can only make us less inclined to pay attention to them, but it cannot prevent us from being convinced, if we do attend to them. Even if we are resistant to the good we are called to choose, that can only make us less likely to believe it and to recognize it as our greatest good. Even if we are drawn toward the evil we ought to avoid, that only makes it harder for us to believe it is the worst of evils. Still, whatever we truly believe is our greatest good, we will always choose, and whatever we are convinced is the worst evil, we will always refuse, as long as we remain convinced. So, the only thing truly needed is for the Holy Spirit to enlighten our minds, so that, by paying attention and thinking carefully, we become aware of and convinced of our duty. The blessings of the gospel must be set before us so that we see them as our greatest good. The miseries it threatens must be shown to us so that we are convinced they are the greatest evils. Thus, we may choose the one and refuse the other. Notice how strongly and plainly it is stated, the greatest good presented, and the greatest evil threatened, when both are equally believed and considered, are sufficient by themselves to move the will to choose the good and refuse the evil. The claim is that nothing else is needed, and to deny this is to fall into contradiction, and therefore must be false. It follows, then, that whatever we truly believe to be our highest good will always be chosen, and whatever we are convinced is the greatest evil will, as long as that conviction lasts, always be rejected. Nothing could be more explicit or direct in showing that the decisions of the will must always follow the enlightenment, conviction, and awareness of the understanding concerning the greatest good and evil, taking into account both the degree of good or evil apprehended and the level of understanding, awareness, and conviction present. This is asserted as a necessity, with no possible exception, for it is said to be a contradiction to suppose it could ever be otherwise. I am aware that Dr. Whitby's purpose in making these statements is to oppose the Calvinists, insisting that there is no need for any direct, physical work of the Spirit of God on the will to change it or cause it to choose the good. Instead, he argues that God's action is purely moral, by presenting ideas to the understanding. If these ideas are attended to, he claims, this alone is enough to accomplish the desired result infallibly. Yet, regardless of his goal, nothing could more directly or thoroughly prove that every choice or refusal of the will is necessary, which is the exact opposite of his own idea of freedom of the will. For if every decision of the will always follows the light, conviction, and perception of the understanding regarding the greatest good and evil, and if this alone moves the will, and it is a contradiction to suggest otherwise, then it must be necessarily so. The will necessarily follows the understanding's view in every act of choosing or refusing. Thus, the will does not determine itself in any of its own acts. Instead, every act of choice and refusal is dependent on, and inseparably connected to, some preceding cause, a cause not found within the will itself, nor any act of its own, nor anything belonging to that faculty, but something from another faculty, whose activity always precedes and governs the will in all its choices. Now, someone might object that, even if it is true, as Dr. Whitby claims, that the will's final decision always depends upon and is unerringly tied to the understanding's conviction and awareness of the greatest good, still, the acts of the will are not truly necessary. Why? Because the understanding's conviction is itself dependent on a prior act of the will, namely, the will's decision to pay attention to the evidence presented. It is by this decision that the mind reaches the level of conviction needed to produce the final, decisive choice of the will. According to this reply, the will is not bound by necessity in that earlier act, when it chooses whether or not to attend to the evidence. It is here, they say, that true liberty of the will is found, that, when God provides sufficient light and evidence, the will remains free to command the mind to pay attention or not. Nothing could be weaker or more short-sighted than this kind of reply. for even that earlier act of the will, when it decides to pay attention and consider, is still, by definition, an act of the will. If, as they suppose, the liberty of the will consists in this, then it is still an act of choosing or refusing. According to Dr. Whitby's own teaching, this choice must be determined by some prior light in the understanding regarding what appears to be the greatest good or evil. For he claims that it is this light alone that ever moves the will to choose or to refuse. Therefore, the will is moved by that perception when it chooses whether to attend to the evidence God has provided, just as much as in any other act of choice. Thus, this act is no less necessary than any other. If we imagine yet another act of the will preceding both of these, one that determines both, then that, too, is still an act of the will, another choice. And so, by the same logic, it also must be infallibly determined by a particular degree of understanding about the greatest good. Suppose there are as many acts of the will, one before the other, as you like, every single one is necessarily determined by some degree of light in the understanding, concerning the best and most desirable option in each situation. Therefore, not a single act of the will is free, according to Dr. Whitby's own idea of freedom. If someone objects that the reason people do not pay attention to the light presented to them is because of bad habits, formed by past evil actions, which make their minds unwilling to consider the truth, this still does not solve the problem. The question simply goes back another step. What determined the will in those earlier evil actions? By Dr. Whitby's own principle, it must have been the understanding's perception of the greatest good and evil at that time. If it is truly the understanding's perception that alone ever moves the will to choose or refuse, as he claims, then every act of choosing or refusing, from a person's very beginning, is determined by this perception, and that perception is always prior to the act. Therefore, in every act of the will, from a person's very first moment, the will is determined by a cause outside itself, a cause that does not arise from any act of the will. This completely destroys Dr. Whitby's entire idea of liberty of the will, undermining all his arguments regarding the goodness, righteousness, faithfulness, and sincerity of God and His commands, promises, warnings, calls, invitations, and appeals, arguments he uses in the debates over reprobation, election, universal redemption, sufficient and effectual grace, and the freedom of human will. It also renders empty all his accusations against Calvinist doctrine, where he claims they charge God with unrighteousness, insincerity, deception, or cruelty. Drive Samuel Clarke, in his demonstration of the being and attributes of God, tries to escape the argument that the will must be necessary, since it is always bound to follow the final judgment of the understanding, by claiming that the last judgment of the understanding is not separate from the act of the will itself. But if this is true, it changes nothing about the necessity of the act. If the understanding's final judgment is actually the same thing as the will's determination, as Dr. Clarke claims, then this determination does not arise as the result or fruit of a free choice. In that case, liberty of choice has nothing to do with it. The act is necessary, meaning, choice cannot prevent it. If the understanding's last dictate is identical to the volition itself, then the existence of that volition is necessary, because the will cannot choose whether it shall exist or not. It already exists, before the will has any chance to decide anything. It is, in fact, the very beginning and existence of volition itself. But once something exists, it is too late to decide whether it should exist. That decision can only be made beforehand. If liberty is, as the Arminians claim, a matter of the will determining its own acts, having true freedom and being subject to no necessity, then liberty must mean that the soul has the power and opportunity to bring about whatever determinations of will it pleases. But if the will's determinations and the last dictates of the understanding are actually the same thing, then liberty must mean the mind has power and opportunity to choose its own judgments or dictates of the understanding. Yet this is nonsense, for it would mean that the choice comes before the understanding's judgment, and is the basis for it. But this cannot be if the understanding's judgment is itself the very act of choice. There is no way out of this dilemma except to fall back on the same old absurdity, a never-ending sequence of one determination before another, with each one causing the next, and so on forever. If the understanding's final judgment is the same thing as the will's determination, and if, according to the Arminian definition, the soul is free in regard to that judgment, then the soul must, before the judgment of the understanding even exists, freely and voluntarily decide what that judgment will be in every case. Otherwise, that judgment is necessary with respect to the will, and so every act determined by it is necessary as well. This means there must be some act of the mind that comes before the judgment of the understanding, a prior act of choice that chooses and decides what that judgment will be. And since this prior act of choice is supposed to be a free act of will, it must itself be identified with yet another last judgment of the understanding. If the mind is also free in that judgment, then that too must be determined by something still earlier, and so on, without end. Furthermore, if the understanding's dictate and the will's determination are the same, this blurs the line between understanding and will, making them identical. Whether or not they are truly the same, I will not discuss now, but I will point out that, if this is true, and if the Arminian idea of liberty consists in the understanding self-determining power, entirely free from necessity, independent, and not determined by anything prior to its own acts, then the more the understanding is independent and sovereign over its own decisions, the more free it is considered to be. In that case, the soul's freedom as a moral agent would actually depend on the understanding being completely independent of all evidence or appearances, or anything at all that might present itself to the mind before the understanding forms its judgment. But what kind of liberty is this? It is the freedom and ability to judge either according to the evidence, or against it, always having the power to judge as one pleases, whether one's judgment agrees or disagrees with what is plainly before the mind. Certainly, such liberty would make a person completely unresponsive to persuasion, reasoning, argument, or any kind of moral appeal, the very things that Arminians use as their chief argument for liberty without all necessity. For by this logic, the more free a person is, the less they are governed by these means, the less subject they are to the force of evidence and reason, and the more independent they are from these influences in their choices. Whether or not the understanding and the will are the same, as Dr. Clarke seems to suggest, still, in order to uphold the Arminian idea of liberty without necessity, the free will must not be determined by the understanding, nor even necessarily connected with it. In fact, the further the will is removed from such a connection, the greater the supposed freedom. When liberty is considered to be at its fullest, the choices of the will would have no connection whatsoever with the judgments of the understanding. If this is true, then all attempts to reach the understanding in order to persuade someone to any truly free and virtuous action are pointless. All instruction, counsel, invitations, appeals, arguments, and persuasions become meaningless, because all of these are simply appeals to the understanding, a way of making the options of choice clear and vivid to the mind. But if, in the end, the will must determine itself, remaining independent of the understanding, what is the point of representing things to the understanding to try to influence the will's choice? Section 10. The act of willing is always necessarily connected to the influence of motives. This point is crucial. In this section, I will pay special attention to the glaring inconsistency found in Mr. Chubb's claims and arguments regarding the freedom of the will. Every act of the will arises from some cause, and therefore, as has already been demonstrated, has a necessary connection with its cause, and is thus necessary by the very nature of that connection. This is plain, for every act of the will is stirred by some motive. This is evident because, if the mind, in its willing, is not prompted by any motive or inducement, then it has no end in view, nor does it pursue any aim in its action. In that case, it seeks nothing and aspires to nothing. But if it seeks nothing, it does not move toward anything, nor does it express any inclination or preference. This leads us into contradiction, for to will something is precisely to move toward something with a preference and inclination. If, then, every act of the will is moved by a motive, that motive is the cause of the act. If the acts of the will are excited by motives, then those motives are the true causes of the acts themselves, the causes of their very existence. If so, then the existence of the acts of the will is truly the effect of their motives. Motives act as motives or inducements only through their influence, and whatever is produced by their influence is, by definition, their effect. For an effect is that which is brought about by the influence of something else. And if volitions are, in truth, the effects of their motives, then they are necessarily joined to their motives. As was previously shown, every effect and event is necessarily bound to that which is the true ground and reason for its existence. It follows, then, that volition is itself necessary, and does not spring from any supposed self-determining power of the will. The volition that arises from prior motives and inducements does not proceed from the will exercising supreme authority over itself, to originate, cause, and excite its own volitions. Such an idea is incompatible with the will's acting from a state of indifference or balance to determine itself to a preference, for motives work by inclining the will and giving it a particular bent or weight in one direction. It is important to note here that Mr. Chubb, in his collection of tracts on various subjects, has set forth a concept of liberty that is deeply divided against itself and, in many ways, destroys its own foundation. 1. He repeatedly asserts that the will, in all its actions, is governed by motive and excitement, that these are the prior grounds and reasons for every act, and that it is never otherwise. He writes, page 262, no action can take place without some motive to excite it. Again, page 263, volition cannot take place without some previous reason or motive to induce it. And on page 310, he declares, action would not take place without some reason or motive to induce it, it being absurd to suppose that the active faculty would be exerted without some previous reason to dispose the mind to action. See also page 257, he regards these truths as absolutely certain, and claims they are the very foundation, the only foundation we have, of our certainty regarding God's moral perfections, pages 252 to 255, 261 to 264. Yet, at the same time, by his scheme, the influence of motives in prompting us to action, and their serving as the ground of volition, is said to depend upon the prior volition or choice of the mind. He insists strongly that, in every free action, before the mind experiences those volitions which motives excite, it chooses to do so. It decides whether it will yield to the motive that presents itself, or not, and when various motives are offered, it chooses which one to embrace and which to reject. On page 256 he says, every man has power to act, or to refrain from acting, in agreement with or contrary to any motive that presents. Page 257, every man is at liberty to act, or to refrain from acting, in agreement with or contrary to what each of these motives, considered alone, would move him to do. Man has power, and is just as free to reject the motive that prevails, as he is to reject those that do not. And also on pages 310, 311, to be a moral agent, a person must have the power to act or to refrain from acting according to the moral motives that please him. He makes similar claims in many other places. According to this, then, the will acts first. It chooses or refuses to comply with the motive presented, before falling under its influence. The mind's pleasure or choice determines which motives it will be influenced by, before it is actually influenced by them. How can these claims be reconciled? How can the mind act first, by an act of willing and choosing, so as to determine which motives will become the ground and reason for its own volition and choice? This requires that the choice is made before the motive has had any effect. It means the will has already been exercised before the motive has prevailed enough to become its basis. Thus, the motives prevailing would be the result of the volition, even though it is supposed to be the reason for that very volition. If the mind has already chosen to comply with a motive and to yield to its prompting, then the prompting of the motive arrives too late and is unnecessary. If the mind has already decided to yield to a motive that urges it towards something, that is, in essence, to choose the very thing the motive incites. The act of choosing, then, comes before the influence of the motive which is supposed to induce and ground the choice. It is as if the Son existed before the Father who begot him. The choice is said to be the reason for the influence of the motive, but that same influence is claimed to be the reason for the choice. In other words, the choice is treated as the result of the motive's influence, while at the same time the motive's influence is the result of that very choice. Moreover, if the will acts first toward the motive, before falling under its influence, and if the motive's prevailing influence is simply the outcome of the will's own act and choice, then how can the motive be the prior ground and reason for the act and choice, so that, by the very nature of things, volition cannot occur without some prior reason and motive to induce it, and that the act of the will follows after the motive? These are points Mr. Chubb repeatedly claims are certain and beyond dispute. So, according to this view, the very same motive must be both prior and subsequent, both before and after, both the ground and the product of one and the same act. In line with this contradictory idea, that the will first acts upon the motive, choosing whether or not to comply with it, before any true act of volition can occur, Mr. Chubb often refers to motives and inducements as the passive ground or reason for the will's actions. This is a most peculiar phrase, one, I dare say, that is as unintelligible and inconsistent as anything found in the writings of Duns Scotus or Thomas Aquinas. When he describes the motive for volition as passive, he must mean passive in relation to the very action he is discussing, otherwise, his point is meaningless. He must mean, if such language can have any meaning at all, that the motive is first acted upon by the will itself, as the will chooses to yield to it, making it the ground of its own action, or deciding to draw its influence from the motive, thereby turning it into a prior ground of its own arising and existence. This is just as absurd as claiming that the soul of a man, before it exists, chooses what cause will bring it into being and acts upon that cause to draw existence from it, so that its cause is a passive ground of its own existence. Yet Mr. Chubb quite plainly holds that motive or inducement is the ground of the will's volition. He calls it the ground or reason for the exertion of the act of will, pages 391 and 392, and directly states that volition cannot take place without some previous ground or motive to induce it, page 363. He further refers to the act as from the motive, and from the influence of the motive, page 352, and as arising from the influence that the motive has on the man, for the production of an action, page 317. Clearly, there is no need to belabor the point. It is plain enough whether a motive can be the ground of volition taking place, so that its very production comes from the motive's influence, and yet, before it becomes this ground, the motive is passive or acted upon by the volition. Let me add this: a man who so often demands clarity of meaning from others, and who so frequently criticizes their confusion and inconsistency, ought, if he were able, to explain this phrase passive ground of action in a way that shows it is not itself confused and contradictory. If anyone were to suggest that Mr. Chubb, when describing motive as a passive ground of action, does not mean passive in relation to the volition for which it is the ground, but rather with respect to some earlier volition, though his reasoning and argument throughout clearly do not permit such an interpretation, this would do nothing to resolve the problem. For, first, if we imagine an act by which the soul chooses to yield to the prompting of a motive for another volition, both of these supposed volitions are, in reality, the very same thing. A volition to yield to a motive inviting one to choose something is effectively the same as simply choosing the thing to which the motive invites, as I have already noted. So there is no way to save the argument by distinguishing between two different volitions. Second, if the motive is said to be passive not with respect to the same volition it excites, but to a truly distinct and prior volition, even then, by Mr. Chubb's own position, that prior volition cannot occur without a motive or inducement as its prior ground. He insists that it is absurd to suppose any volition should take place without some previous motive to induce it. Therefore, we arrive again at the same contradiction. If every volition must have a prior motive, then the very first volition in any series must also be moved by a prior motive, yet, the motive for that first volition is passive. But it cannot be passive with respect to another earlier volition, for by definition, it is the first. Thus, if it is passive in relation to any volition, it must be with respect to the very volition for which it serves as the ground and which it is supposed to excite. 3. Although Mr. Chubb asserts, as stated above, that every volition has some motive, and that by the very nature of the case, no volition can take place without some motive to induce it, yet he also claims that volition does not always follow the strongest motive, or in other words, is not always determined by the superior strength of the motive prior to the volition itself. His own words, page 258, are, though with regard to physical causes, the strongest always prevails, yet it is otherwise concerning moral causes. Among these, sometimes the stronger, sometimes the weaker prevails. The reason for this difference is plain. What we call moral causes, strictly speaking, are not causes at all, but only passive reasons for, or inducements to, action or inaction, inducements which we have the power, or liberty, to accept or reject, as I have previously shown. Throughout the paragraph, he repeatedly asserts, in various ways, that the will is not always determined by the strongest motive, unless by strongest we simply mean that which actually prevails in the event, which, in his view, depends not on the motive, but on the will itself. Thus, the will is not always determined by the motive that is strongest prior to the volition itself. Elsewhere, he strongly insists that the will is determined by no superior force or advantage that motives possess from any constitution, state of affairs, or circumstances whatever, prior to the actual choice of the will. Indeed, his entire discussion of human liberty assumes this, and his whole system depends on it. But these claims cannot be reconciled. There is, before the act of choosing, a real difference in the strength of motives that invite or prompt the will. Mr. Chubb himself admits that motives do, in fact, invite, induce, excite, and dispose the mind to action. This means that each motive contains, in itself, some quality that is inviting, a tendency to move the will to act before any actual volition has occurred. And if motives possess this power or tendency within themselves, it must exist in varying degrees. Some motives are more compelling, others less so, and those with the greatest power, considering their full nature and circumstances, are the strongest motives, while those with the least are the weakest. If it is true, then, that the will sometimes chooses not the strongest motive, not the one with the greatest prior tendency or advantage to excite or move the mind, but instead follows the weaker, the least inviting motive as it appears to the mind, then the will acts, in such cases, entirely without motive or prior reason to guide it. This is contrary to what Mr. Chubb himself insists upon. The very act in which the will must operate without a prior motive to induce it is the act of preferring the weaker motive. For how unreasonable is it to say that the mind sees some prior reason in the motive to prefer it over the other, and at the same time to suppose that there is nothing, in the nature or circumstances of that motive, as it appears to the mind, to give it any such preference. On the contrary, the opposing motive, in all respects, has more to commend it, more to excite and incline the mind to choose it. This is, in fact, to say that there is both a prior reason in the motive for the act of preference and, at the same time, no prior reason at all. By this account, everything that, before the act of preference, tends to draw the mind toward one or the other, actually lies in the motive that is not chosen, and yet Mr. Chubb claims that the act of preference is based on a prior ground or reason found in the motive that is chosen. But can these things go together? Can there be a prior ground in something for an event, and yet no prior tendency in it toward that event? If one thing is said to follow another with no prior tendency to do so, it is clear that it happens without any real prior reason at all. Indeed, in this scenario, Mr. Chubb supposes that the event, the preference the mind gives to the weaker motive, follows from an antecedent that not only lacks any tendency toward that outcome, but actually has a contrary tendency. The event is the mind's preference for the motive which, by its very nature and in the mind's prior view, is weaker. The immediate antecedent is the mind's combined view of the two competing motives, but in this prior view, all the preferableness and tendency to preference belongs to the opposite motive, and all the reasons for neglect or undervaluing lie with the very motive that is, in fact, chosen. Yet Mr. Chubb claims that this view of the mind is the prior ground or reason that excites and disposes the mind to this act of preference. I leave it to the reader to judge whether this is not utterly absurd. If it is not, then it would not be absurd to say that the very reason a consequence does not follow is because the prior tendency points toward it, and, in turn, that the absence of any prior tendency, or even a tendency in the opposite direction, is actually the true ground for why an event does follow. An act of choice or preference is inherently comparative. The mind chooses with respect to two or more things that it weighs and compares in its view. If, in such a comparative act, the mind prefers what appears inferior in the comparison, then it is acting entirely without motive, inducement, or any temptation whatsoever. Suppose a hungry man is offered two types of food, and he has some appetite for both, but a stronger appetite for one than the other. If there are no additional circumstances or inducements to favor either, and his choice rests solely on appetite, but he chooses the one for which his appetite is weakest and rejects the one for which it is strongest, this is a choice made wholly without any prior motive, excitement, reason, or temptation, as much as if he had no appetite for either food at all. In this case, his will is a comparative act based on his view of the options, yet the choice made has absolutely no prior ground in the motive. Indeed, it goes against every prior ground and inducement. If there is any principle in man by which such a choice could arise, then by the same principle, volition could arise without any motive on either side. If the mind, in its willing, can move beyond the influence of motives, then it can act altogether without motives, for if it acts beyond them, it is outside their reach and beyond their power, and so, in truth, without motive. This, then, proves the independence of volition from motives, and leaves no explanation for Mr. Chubb's frequent claim that by the nature of things, volition cannot take place without a motive to induce it. If the Almighty were to give agency or active power to a balanced scale, so that when unequal weights are placed in its pans, it could, by its own action, cause the side with the lighter weight to descend and lift the side with the heavier weight, this would clearly prove that the motion of the balance does not depend on the weights in the scales, at least as much as if the balance were to move itself when there were no weights at all. The activity of the balance, if sufficient to overcome a greater weight, would surely be more than enough to move the scale when there is no weight whatsoever. Mr. Chubb claims that the will cannot move at all without some motive, and he also maintains that if there is a motive for one action and none for the opposite, the will inevitably follows that motive. This amounts, in effect, to saying that the will is entirely dependent on motives. If the will were not wholly dependent, surely it could help itself at least a little without any motive, or even resist a motive to some degree without needing the strength of an opposing motive. Yet, in supposing that the will, when confronted with opposing motives, can use them as it wishes, choosing which to be influenced by, neglecting the strongest and following the weakest, he is actually assuming the will is completely independent of motives. Moreover, Mr. Chubb's view leads to the further conclusion that volition must sometimes occur without any prior ground in motive. For if, as he proposes, the will is not determined by the superior strength of any motive, but instead selects its own motive, then whenever the competing motives are exactly equal in every respect, the will may sometimes follow one and sometimes the other. In this scenario, the variation between the acts of the will plainly cannot be explained by any difference in the motives, since, by assumption, they are identical in every way. Absolute sameness in all that is prior cannot account for any difference in what follows. Therefore, the source of this diversity in the will's choices must be found elsewhere. Finally, it is worth noting that, no matter how strongly Mr. Chubb asserts that no volition can occur without some motive to induce it, some prior influence that disposes the mind to act, he also maintains that the mind, apart from any superior strength of motives, freely selects which motive to follow. In this, he clearly implies that, when it comes to preferring one motive over another, it is not the motive that disposes the will, but the will itself that disposes itself to follow a given motive. 4. Mr. Chubb claims that necessity is completely incompatible with true agency. To suppose that a being is an agent in any matter that is necessary, he calls a plain contradiction. Cp. 311. Throughout his writings on liberty, he maintains that necessity cannot coexist with either agency or freedom, and that to think otherwise is to conflate liberty with necessity, and action with mere passion. He even appears to hold that the only true action is volition itself, and that, as for the necessary effects of volition in the body or mind, considered in themselves, these are only called free because they arise from an act, the volition, that itself is not necessary. And yet, according to Mr. Chubb's reasoning, volition itself is the effect of volition. Indeed, every act of free will is the effect of a preceding act of will. Therefore, by what has just been shown from his own words, every act of free volition must itself be necessary. That every act of free volition is the effect of another volition is assumed repeatedly in his argument. For example, on page 341, he writes, "If a man is such a creature as I have proved him to be, that is, if he possesses a power of liberty to do either good or evil, and either is the subject of his own free choice, so that he might, if he had pleased, have chosen and done the contrary." Here he presupposes that all which is good or evil in man is the result of his choice, and thus, that his good or evil choices themselves are the effects of his pleasure or prior choice, as in his words, he might, if he had pleased, have chosen the contrary. Again, on page 356, though it be highly reasonable that a man should always choose the greater good, yet he may, if he pleases, choose otherwise. This is simply saying that he may, if he chooses, choose otherwise. He continues, that is, he may, if he pleases, choose what is good for himself, and so on. Again, on the same page, the will is not confined by the understanding to any particular sort of good, whether greater or less, but it is at liberty to choose what kind of good it pleases. If these last words mean anything, it must be that the will is free to choose what it chooses to choose, implying that every act of choice is determined by an antecedent choice. The liberty that Mr. Chubb describes is not simply the power to move the body according to a prior act of choice, but also the ability to use or exercise the faculties of the soul. Thus, on page 379, speaking of the mind's faculties, he says, "Man has power, and is at liberty to neglect these faculties, to use them aright, or to abuse them, as he pleases. That he understands an act of choice, or a preference, as truly distinct from and prior to the acts thus chosen, directing, commanding, and producing those acts, even the acts of choice themselves, is perfectly clear on page 283. He can command his actions, and herein consists his liberty. He can give or deny himself that pleasure, as he pleases." And on page 377. "If the actions of men are not the product of a free choice or election, but spring from a necessity of nature, he cannot reasonably be the object of reward or punishment on their account. But if action in man, whether good or evil, is the product of will or free choice, so that a man in either case had it in his power, and was at liberty to have chosen the contrary, he is the proper object of reward or punishment, according as he chooses to behave himself." Here, in these words, he speaks of the liberty of choosing as he chooses, so that the very choice itself, as well as the outward action that follows, is regarded as subject to his will. It is evident, then, that he means not only outward actions, but the acts of choosing themselves, when he describes all free actions as the result of free choice. This is made even more apparent in what he says elsewhere, pages 372 to 373. These positions entail two profound contradictions. 1. To claim, as Mr. Chubb clearly does, that every free act of choice is governed by, and is the result of, a previous act of free choice, is to claim that the very first free act of choice ever performed by a person is itself the effect of an earlier choice. But I trust it hardly needs demonstration to show my readers the absurdity of asserting that the very first act could be produced by another act that came before it. 2. Even if it were both possible and true, as Mr. Chubb maintains, that every free act of choice is the product or effect of a previous act of choice, then even in that case, by his own principles, not one act of choice would be truly free, but every one would be necessary. 4. If every act of choice is the effect of a prior act, then every act is inevitably linked to that preceding cause. Indeed, Mr. Chubb himself says, page 389, when the self-moving power is exerted, it becomes the necessary cause of its effects. Thus, his idea of a free act, one deserving reward or punishment, is an entire tangle of contradictions. It is an act that is free, and yet, by his own definition of freedom, is necessary, and so, by his reasoning, it is a contradiction to call it free. By his view, every free act is produced by another free act, so that there must be an endless chain of free acts, without beginning, in a creature that itself has a beginning. This leads to the absurdity of an infinite succession of free acts, each one supposedly free, and yet none of them truly free, since every act in the infinite series is a necessary effect. All these acts are, by his account, rewardable or punishable, and yet the agent cannot reasonably be the subject of reward or punishment for any of them. The agent is described as active in them all, passive in none, and yet, in truth, active in none and passive in all, and so on. 5. Mr. Chubb most vigorously denies that motives are the causes of acts of the will, or that the moving principle in man is set in motion or brought into action by motives. He writes, pages 388 to 389, if the moving principle in man is moved, or caused to be exerted, by something external to man, which all motives are, then it would not be a self-moving principle, since it would be moved by something external to itself. To say that a self-moving principle is moved, or caused to be exerted, by a cause external to itself is absurd and a contradiction, and so forth. On the next page, he elaborates at length, arguing that motives are in no case causes, that they are merely passive in the production of action, and have no causality in bringing it about, no power to be the cause of the will's exertion. But let us now consider how this can possibly be consistent with his statements elsewhere. Take note, first, Mr. Chubb frequently describes motives as excitements to acts of the will, saying that motives do, in fact, excite and induce volition, and that they are absolutely necessary for this very purpose, that, in the very nature of things, volition cannot occur without motives to excite it. Yet if motives excite the will, they must move it, and yet he insists it is absurd to say that the will is moved by motives. Again, if words are to have any meaning, if motives excite volition, then they are the cause of its being excited, and to cause volition to be excited is simply to cause it to come forth and be exerted. Mr. Chubb himself admits, page 317, that motive is necessary for the exertion of the active faculty. To excite is actively to do something, and certainly, that which actively does something is the cause of what is done. To create is to cause to be created, to make is to cause to be made, to kill is to cause to be killed, to quicken is to cause to be quickened, and to excite is to cause to be excited. To excite is to be a cause in the most direct sense, not just a passive occasion but a true ground of existence by positive influence. The very idea of exciting is to exert influence that brings the effect into being. 2. Mr. Chubb himself, on page 317, describes motives as the ground and reason for action by their influence, and specifically by their prevailing influence. But what else do we mean by a cause, except something that serves as the ground and reason for an event through its own influence, an influence that is effective in determining. 3. Not only does he speak of motives as the ground and reason of action by prevailing influence, but he also explicitly refers to their influence as prevailing for the production of an action, page 317, which makes the contradiction all the more obvious and glaring. To produce an effect is surely to cause that effect. Productive influence is, by its very nature, causal influence. That which possesses this prevailing influence, so as to become the ground of something else, is indeed the cause of that thing, if the term cause has any meaning at all. Mr. Chubb says that motives have this influence to produce action, and yet he calls it absurd and contradictory to say that they are causes. 4. In that very same page, he repeatedly describes motives as disposing the agent to action by their influence. His words are, a motive, which arises in the understanding and is the product of intelligence, is necessary to action, that is, to the exertion of the active faculty, because that faculty would not be exerted without some previous reason to dispose the mind to action. So from this it plainly appears that, when a man is said to be disposed to one action rather than another, This properly refers to the prevailing influence that one motive has upon him for the production of an action, or for remaining at rest, over all other motives to the contrary. 4. As motive is the ground and reason of any action, so the motive that prevails disposes the agent to the performance of that action. Now, if motives dispose the mind to act, then they must cause the mind to be disposed. To cause the mind to be disposed is to cause it to be willing, and to cause it to be willing is to cause it to will, which is nothing less than being the cause of an act of the will itself. And yet, this same Mr. Chubb insists that it is absurd to suppose that a motive could ever be the cause of an act of the will. If we set all these statements side by side, we are once again faced with a mountain of contradictions. Motives are said to be the prior ground and reason for the acts of the will, even the necessary ground and reason for their exercise, without which such acts will not, and cannot, occur. Motives are said to excite the acts of the will by their prevailing influence, indeed, an influence that brings about the act and disposes the mind toward it. Yet, at the same time, it is deemed absurd to suggest that a motive could be the cause of an act of the will, or that the will is moved or brought into action by it, or that a motive has any causative power in producing the act, or any power to be the cause of the will's exertion. A careful reflection on these claims and the glaring contradictions into which Mr. Chubb's definition of liberty, namely, the will's supposed power of self-determination apart from all necessity, has forced him, together with the undeniable fact that there can be no act of will without a motive, ought to persuade us that it is utterly impossible to make such a view of liberty harmonize with the influence of motives in volition. Just as it is self-evident that there can be no act of will or choice of the mind without some motive or inducement, something within the mind's view that it seeks or desires, so it is equally clear that the kind of liberty claimed by the Arminians does not exist anywhere in the universe, nor is such a thing even possible or conceivable. Section 11. The evidence for God's definite foreknowledge of the choices of moral agents. That the choices of moral agents are not contingent events, so as to be without any necessity at all, is shown by the fact that God has certain foreknowledge of these events. In developing this argument, I will first prove that God does indeed possess absolute and certain foreknowledge of the voluntary actions of moral agents, and second, I will show how this foreknowledge necessarily means that the choices of moral agents are not purely contingent, but are bound by a necessary connection and consequence. First, I must prove that God has an absolute and infallible knowledge beforehand of the free actions of moral agents. One might imagine it entirely unnecessary to argue this point with anyone who claims to be a Christian, yet, it remains the case that some who profess to accept the Scriptures as the Word of God, especially in recent times, have denied God's certain foreknowledge of the free acts of moral agents. Therefore, I will examine the evidence for such divine prescience as fully as the scope of this essay allows, assuming throughout that I am speaking with those who acknowledge the authority of the Bible. Argument 1. My first argument will be drawn from God's prediction of such events. Before proceeding, let me set forth two axioms. If God does not foreknow these events, he cannot foretell them, at least not with certainty and authority. If God has only an uncertain guess about such matters, then he can declare nothing more than an uncertain guess. To predict positively is to claim certain foreknowledge, or to declare with certainty that one knows what will be. 1. If God does not certainly foreknow the future choices of moral agents, then neither can he certainly foreknow any events that depend on those choices. The existence of such events depends upon the existence of the choices themselves. Therefore, knowledge of the one depends on knowledge of the other, and neither can be more certain than the other. Therefore, however many, however great, and however far-reaching the consequences of the choices of moral agents may be, even if they should alter the very state of the universe, or continue through an endless series of events, branching out into infinite chains of consequences, God must be just as ignorant of all these outcomes as he is of the original choice from which they spring. The entire state of things dependent on such choices, no matter how important, vast, or far-reaching, must be hidden from his sight. Since these points are ones I expect no one will dispute, I will now proceed to note the following facts. The moral behavior and qualities of men, their virtues and vices, their evil and good deeds, and those things that are worthy of reward or punishment, have often been directly foretold by God. For instance, Pharaoh's moral conduct in refusing to obey God's command and let his people go was foretold. God declares to Moses in Exodus 3:19, "I am sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go." Here God is not merely making a guess, he asserts certain knowledge of Pharaoh's future disobedience. Again, in Exodus 7:4, God says, "But Pharaoh shall not hearken unto you, that I may lay my hand upon Egypt," and in Exodus 9:30, Moses says to Pharaoh, "As for you and your servants, I know that you will not fear the Lord." See also Exodus 11:9. The moral actions of Josiah, named specifically for his zealous opposition to idolatry and precise deeds, were foretold more than 300 years before his birth. This prophecy was sealed by a miracle and reaffirmed by the words of a second prophet, declaring it certain and inevitable. 1 Kings 13 1-6, 32. This prediction also included the behavior of the people, in sustaining their unlawful and idolatrous worship until that time, as well as the idolatry of the priests whom Josiah would later sacrifice on the altar at Bethel. The prophet Micah foretold Ahab's foolish and sinful conduct, how he would refuse to listen to the word of the Lord and instead believe false prophets, leading to his destruction at Ramoth-Gilead. 1 Kings 22:20-22. Hazael's cruel conduct was foretold, to which Hazael replied, "What, is your servant a dog, that he should do this great thing?" The prophet nevertheless speaks of it as certain knowledge, not mere conjecture. "I know the evil that you will do to the children of Israel. You will dash their children and rip up their women with child." 2 Kings 8:12. Cyrus's actions, long before his birth, were foretold, how he would show mercy to God's people and honor the true God by freeing the Jews and aiding the rebuilding of the temple. Isaiah 44:28, 45:13. Compare 2 Chronicles 36:22-23 and Ezra 1:1-4. How many instances of the moral conduct of the kings of the north and south, particularly the evil deeds of the kings of Syria and Egypt, are predicted in Daniel chapter 11. Their corruption, violence, robbery, treachery, and lies are all described. Especially, the wickedness of Antiochus Epiphanes, a vile person, rather than Epiphanes, meaning illustrious, is detailed, his flattery, deceit, lies, his heart set against the holy covenant, his persecution and destruction of the holy people, his defilement of the sanctuary, his pride and blasphemy against God, and his ultimate destruction by divine judgment. Daniel 8:9-14 and 23 to the end, 11:21-35. The conduct of the Jews in the face of his persecution is also foretold, how many would be corrupted by flattery, Daniel 11:32-34, while others would stand firm with remarkable faithfulness, and some would stumble and repent, verse 35. Christ foretold Peter's sin in denying his Lord, describing it and its circumstances with absolute certainty. Likewise, the great sin of Judas in betraying his master, and the terrible, eternal judgment that would follow, was foretold just as certainly, Matthew 26:21-25, and the parallel passages in the other Gospels. 2. Many events have been foretold by God that depended directly on the moral conduct of specific individuals, and were brought about either by their virtuous or by their wicked actions. For example, the descent of the children of Israel into Egypt to live there was foretold to Abraham, Genesis 15, and this prophecy was fulfilled through the evil of Joseph's brothers in selling him, the wickedness of Joseph's master's wife, and Joseph's own outstanding virtue in resisting her temptation. The fulfillment of what Joseph saw in his dreams likewise depended upon these moral choices. Jotham's parable and prophecy, Judges 9:15-20, came to pass through the wicked deeds of Abimelech and the men of Shechem. The prophecies against the house of Eli, 1 Samuel 2 and 3, were fulfilled by the evil of Doeg the Edomite, who accused the priests, and by the great impiety and cruelty of Saul, who destroyed the priests at Nob, 1 Samuel 22. Nathan's prophecy against David, 2 Samuel 12:11-12, was accomplished by the monstrous wickedness of Absalom, who rebelled against his father, sought his life, and violated his concubines openly. The prophecy against Solomon, 1 Kings 11:11-13, was fulfilled through Jeroboam's rebellion and seizure of power, an act explicitly described as his wickedness. See 2 Chronicles 13:5-6, 18. The prophecy against Jeroboam's house, 1 Kings 14, was accomplished by the conspiracy, treason, and violent murders of Baasha, see 2 Kings 15:27, etc. The predictions made by the prophet Jehu against Baasha's house, 1 Kings 16, at the beginning, were fulfilled through the treachery and murder committed by Zimri, 1 Kings 16:9-13, 20. How often has God foretold the future moral conduct of whole nations and peoples, of entire groups, communities, and generations, with all of God's judicial dealings and the many events that follow, events that depend directly on their virtues and vices. These outcomes could never have been foreknown if the choices of men, in their role as moral agents, had not first been foreseen. For example, the future cruelty of the Egyptians in oppressing Israel, and God's judgment and punishment of them for it, was foretold long before it happened, Genesis 15:13-14. The continuation and increase of the iniquity of the Amorites, until their sin was full and they were ripe for judgment, was foretold more than 400 years in advance, Genesis 15:16, Acts 7:6-7. The prophecies of the destruction of Jerusalem and the land of Judah were absolute, 2 Kings 20:17-19, 22:15 end. These were announced in Hezekiah's time and are repeatedly emphasized in the book of Isaiah, who wrote nothing after Hezekiah's reign. The same destruction was foretold again in Josiah's day, at the very beginning of a great reformation, 2 Kings 22. It is clear from the many specific details in the prophets, regarding the event itself, its timing, its circumstances, its length, the return from exile, the restoration of the temple, city, and land, that these predictions were absolute. Yet this momentous event was closely connected with, and dependent on, two aspects of human moral conduct. First, the violent plundering and cruelty of the king of Babylon and his people, which God often said he deeply resented and would punish severely, and second, the final stubbornness of the Jews. This destruction and captivity is repeatedly described as being suspended on the Jews' moral choices. See Jeremiah 4:1, 5-1, 7-1-7, 11-1-6, 17:24 end, 25-1-7, 26-1-8, 13, 38:17-18. Therefore, the destruction and exile could not have been foreknown unless both the conduct of the Chaldeans and the Jews had been foreknown. Furthermore, it was foretold that the people would ultimately remain stubborn, leading to the utter desolation of the city and land, Isaiah 6:9-11, Jeremiah 1:18-19, 7:27-29, Ezekiel 3:7, 24:13-14. God also foretold the ongoing obstinacy of those Jews left in the land, in their idolatry and rejection of the true God, and he confirmed this prophecy with an oath, Jeremiah 44:26-27. God tells the people, Isaiah 48:3-4, 8, that he predicted these things, which would come as a consequence of their treachery and stubbornness, precisely because he knew they would be obstinate. He declared these things beforehand so that, when they came to pass, they would be convinced he alone is truly God. The destruction of Babylon, with many of its circumstances, was foretold as the judgment of God for the extraordinary pride and arrogance of the rulers of that empire, Nebuchadnezzar and his successors, and for their wicked destruction of other nations, especially for exalting themselves against the true God and his people, long before any of these monarchs even existed. See Isaiah 13, 14, 47, compare Habakkuk 2:5 end, and Jeremiah 50-51. That Babylon's destruction would be a recompense, according to the works of their own hands, is made clear in Jeremiah 25:14. The immorality for which the people of Babylon, especially her princes and leaders, were guilty on the very night the city fell, their revelry and drunkenness at Belshazzar's idolatrous feast, was also specifically foretold, Jeremiah 51:39 and 57. The return of the Jews from Babylonian exile was foretold repeatedly and in great detail, with many definite circumstances, and the promises of their return were given in the most decisive terms, Jeremiah 31:35-40, 32:6-15, 41-44, 33:24-26. The exact time of their return was even specified, Jeremiah 25:11-12, 29:10-11, 2 Chronicles 36:21, Ezekiel 4:6, Daniel 9:2. Yet these prophecies present the return as a result of their repentance. And this very repentance is also clearly and explicitly foretold, Jeremiah 29:12-14, 31:8-9, 18-31, 33-8, 50-4-5, Ezekiel 6:8-10, 7:16, 14:22-23, 20:43-44. Under the Old Testament, it was foretold that the Messiah would suffer greatly at the hands of sinful men. This is presented in detail in Psalm 22, applied to Christ in Matthew 27:35 and 43, Luke 23:34, John 19:24, Hebrews 2:12, as well as in Psalm 69, shown to be about Christ in John 15:25, 2:17, Romans 15:3, Matthew 27:34 and 48, Mark 15:23, John 19:29. The same suffering is foretold in Isaiah 53 and 50-6, and Micah 5:1. This cruelty was the sin of men, something they did as moral agents. It was foretold that both Gentile and Jewish rulers would unite against Christ, Psalm 2:1-2, compared with Acts 4:25-28. The widespread rejection and contempt for the Messiah by the Jewish people was foretold, Isaiah 49:5-7, 53:1-3, Psalm 22:6-7, 69-4, 8, 19-20. It was also foretold that the majority of the nation would be rejected in the days of the Messiah for their persistent disobedience. Isaiah 49 4-7, 8:14-16, compared with Romans 10:19, Isaiah 65 1-2, compared with Romans 10:20-21. Furthermore, it was foretold that Christ would be rejected by the chief priests and rulers among the Jews, Psalm 118:22, compared with Matthew 21:42, Acts 4:11, 1 Peter 2:4-7. Christ himself foretold that he would be delivered into the hands of the elders, chief priests, and scribes, that he would be cruelly treated and condemned to death, that he would be handed over to the Gentiles, to be mocked, scourged, and crucified. See Matthew 16:21, 20:17-19, Luke 9:22, John 8:28. He foretold that the people themselves would be involved in and consent to his death. Luke 20:13-18, especially the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Luke 13:33-35. He prophesied that all the disciples would stumble because of him on the night he was betrayed, and would forsake him. Matthew 26:31, John 16:32. He declared that he would be rejected by that entire generation, even the body of the people, and that they would persist in their unbelief to their own ruin. See Matthew 12:45, 21:33-42, 22:1-7, Luke 13:16 and 21 and 24, 17:25, 19:14, 27, 41, 44, 20:13-18, 23:34-39. Just as it was foretold in both the Old and New Testaments that the Jews would reject the Messiah, so too was it foretold that the Gentiles would receive him and be welcomed into the blessings of God's people, in passages too numerous now to list. The Old Testament also predicted that the Jews would envy the Gentiles for this reason, Deuteronomy 32:21, compared with Romans 10:19. Christ himself repeatedly foretold that the Gentiles would accept the true faith and become his followers. Matthew 8:10-12, 21:41-43, 22:8-10, Luke 13:28, 14:16-24, 20:16, John 10:16. He also predicted the Jews' envy at this. Matthew 20:12-16, Luke 15:26 and. He declared that they would persist in this opposition and envy, displaying it in violent persecutions of his followers, even to their utter ruin. Matthew 21:33-42, 22-6, 23:34-39, Luke 11:49-51. The obstinacy of the Jews is again foretold, Acts 22:18. Christ frequently prophesied the great persecutions that his followers would face from both Jews and Gentiles. Matthew 10:16-18, 21-22, 34-36, 24-9, Mark 13:9, Luke 10:3, 12:11, 49-53, 21:12, 16-17, John 15:18-21, 16-1-4, 20-23. He foretold the martyrdom of certain individuals. Matthew 20:23, John 13:36, 21:18-19, 22. He also predicted the great success of the gospel in Samaria, which was later fulfilled by Philip's preaching. John 4:35-38. Christ foretold the rise of many deceivers after his departure. Matthew 24:4-5, 11. And the falling away of many professed believers. Matthew 24:10 and 12. The persecutions that the Apostle Paul was to endure in the world were specifically foretold. Acts 9:16, 20:23, 21:11. Paul himself told the Ephesian Christians, "I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock, and from among your own selves men will arise, speaking twisted things, to draw away the disciples after them." Acts 20:29-30. Paul says he knows these things, but he could not truly know them unless God himself knew the future actions of moral agents. 4. Unless God foreknows the future actions of moral agents, then all the prophecies found in Scripture about the great antichristian apostasy, the rise, reign, character, and deeds of the man of sin, along with his followers and accomplices, the reach and long duration of his rule, his power to corrupt rulers and others, leading them into idolatry and many other sins, his fierce and brutal persecutions, and the response of the saints under such temptations, must have been spoken without any real knowledge of what was to come. These predictions all concern matters of morality, men's virtues and vices, their behaviors and their consequences, and the events that depend upon them. These prophecies are remarkably detailed, frequently repeated, and include many specific marks, descriptions, limits, conduct, effects, reach, length, seasons, circumstances, and final outcomes, too many to list in detail here. To imagine that all these were foretold by God without any certain knowledge of the future moral conduct of free agents is utterly unreasonable. 5. Unless God foreknows the future choices of men, their wills and their conduct as moral agents, then all the great things foretold in both the Old and New Testaments concerning the coming, establishment, and worldwide expansion of the Messiah's kingdom must have been spoken and promised while God remained in ignorance as to whether any of these things would ever happen, and could only offer a guess. For Christ's kingdom is not of this world. It is not a matter of external things, but is established within men. It consists in the rule of virtue in their hearts, in righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit, and in these virtues being manifest in lives that bring praise and glory to God. The Messiah came to save his people from their sins, to deliver them from their spiritual enemies, that they might serve him in righteousness and holiness. He gave himself for us to redeem us from all iniquity and purify a people for his own possession, zealous for good works. Therefore, his success lies in winning the hearts of men to virtue, making them God's willing people in the day of his power. His conquest of his enemies consists in his triumph over the sins and corruptions of people. This kind of victory and dominion is often expressly foretold, that his kingdom will fill the earth, that all peoples, nations, and languages will serve and obey him, that all nations will go up to the house of the Lord, that he may teach them his ways and that they may walk in his paths, that all men will be drawn to Christ, that the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord, of true virtue and religion, as the waters cover the sea, that God's law will be written on people's hearts, that God's people will be entirely righteous, and so forth. A very large portion of Old Testament prophecy is devoted to such predictions. It is worth noting that the prophecies concerning the worldwide success of the Messiah's kingdom and the true faith of Jesus Christ are delivered in the strongest, most decisive terms, and confirmed by the very oath of God himself. Turn to me and be saved, all the ends of the earth, for I am God and there is no other. I have sworn by myself, the word has gone out of my mouth in righteousness and will not return. Every knee shall bow to me, every tongue shall swear allegiance. Surely, one shall say, in the Lord is righteousness and strength. To him shall men come. Isaiah 45:22 end. Yet here is the most solemn oath and pronouncement of the Most High, declared about matters which, if God does not certainly foresee the choices of moral agents, he did not truly know. The same holds for all Christ's predictions and those of the apostles. When Jesus compared the kingdom of God to a mustard seed, growing from the smallest seed into the largest plant, or to leaven, spreading until it permeates all the dough, these were declarations about a sure outcome. So too are the apostolic prophecies about the restoration of the Jewish people, the gathering of the full number of the Gentiles, and all the predictions in Revelation about the glorious transformation of the moral state of humanity with the fall of Antichrist. The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and the church is given fine linen, bright and clean, which is the righteous acts of the saints. Corollary 1. Therefore, that great promise and oath which God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, so often celebrated in both the Old and New Testaments, that in their seed all the nations and families of the earth shall be blessed, would rest on uncertainties if God did not have certain foreknowledge of the choices of moral agents. For the fulfillment of this promise lies in Christ's success in the work of redemption, and in the establishment of his spiritual kingdom throughout the nations of the world, as just described. Men are blessed in Christ only as they are brought to know him, trust in him, love him, and serve him, just as it is represented and foretold in Psalm 72:11. All kings shall fall down before him, all nations shall serve him, and verse 17, men shall be blessed in him, all nations shall call him blessed. This oath to Jacob and Abraham is fulfilled by the subduing of men's iniquities, as is implied by the prophet Micah, 7:19-20. Corollary 2. It likewise follows that the very first gospel promise ever made to humanity, that great prediction of the Messiah's salvation and his triumph over Satan, given to our first parents, Genesis 3:15, must also be based on nothing more than conjecture, if there is no certain foreknowledge of the choices of moral agents. For Christ's victory over Satan consists in men being saved from sin, and in the triumph of virtue and holiness over the vice and wickedness which Satan, through his temptations, has brought into the world and by which his kingdom stands. If, in fact, God does not possess foreknowledge of the future actions of moral agents, then it follows that the prophecies of Scripture as a whole are made without true foreknowledge. For nearly all, if not every, biblical prophecy is either a prediction concerning the actions and behavior of moral agents, or of events that depend on such actions, or are otherwise connected with them, judgments and divine punishments for wickedness, rewards for virtue and righteousness, remarkable displays of favor toward the righteous, or sovereign mercy toward sinners, forgiveness of iniquity, and the magnifying of divine grace. Even God's providential dealings are related in some way to the conduct of those under his moral government, being wisely adapted to their behavior, either providing for what will come in the future through the choices and actions of moral agents, or occurring as consequences of them, and being ordered in response to them. Thus, all events that are foretold are either moral in nature, or else are linked to and shaped by such moral events. That the prophecies of Scripture, in general, would be made without knowledge if God does not foresee human choices, becomes even clearer when we consider that almost every significant event in the future history of humanity, the changes and revolutions among empires, kingdoms, nations, and every society, depends in countless ways on the acts of human wills, indeed on a virtually infinite multitude of volitions. The course of human affairs is such that even a single event, however trivial it might seem at the time, may, through the unfolding sequence of consequences, result in a chain of the most weighty, far-reaching events, altering the destiny of humanity for generations to come. For example, consider the rise of those particular individuals who became the great conquerors of history, men like Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, Alexander the Great, Pompey, Julius Caesar, and others, who, by God's providence, shaped the destiny of the world for generations to come. The very existence of these men depended on countless choices of will made by their parents, indeed, on millions of acts of will. And most of those parental volitions themselves depended on millions more decisions by their contemporaries, and so on, stretching back generation after generation, where each link multiplies like the branching of a great river, until finally, the number of volitional acts influencing the outcome becomes, for all practical purposes, infinite. This will not seem far-fetched to anyone who thoughtfully considers the matter, especially if we recall what philosophers say about the countless multitudes of factors involved in generation. The multitudes of living particles in male seed and the ova in the womb of the female. The fertilization and animation of a single one, out of all the rest, depends on an infinite number of minute circumstances, the timing and circumstances of the parents' actions, the state of their bodies, and so on, each depending in turn on countless earlier situations, which themselves depended in 1,000 ways on prior choices of will. These choices, in turn, arose from the countless events that shaped their lives, events influenced by their own actions and those of their neighbors in innumerable ways. And just as the choices of others play an incalculable role in the conception and birth of such individuals, so too do they factor into their preservation and all the circumstances of their lives, the very circumstances and decisions on which all the great changes they brought about depended. Take, for instance, the moment in Persia when conspirators against the Magi debated the succession to the throne. It happened that one suggested whoever's horse neighed first the next morning should be king. This small idea entering his mind may have depended on an infinite chain of circumstances, each rooted in human choices. Yet this accident led to Darius, son of Hystaspes, becoming king. Had it been otherwise, his successor likely would have been different, and the entire fate of the Persian Empire might have changed. Alexander, in turn, might never have conquered Persia, and the course of history for all subsequent generations could have been entirely different. One could add countless other examples. The fragile circumstances on which Alexander's survival rested in the many crises of his life, how sometimes the smallest detail could have ended his career, or the early preservation and success of the Roman people, on which the later revolutions of the world depended. But these brief illustrations are enough for any thoughtful person to see that the entire history of mankind, the very existence of every person who has ever lived since the times of the ancient prophets, has depended on more volitions, more acts of human will, than there are grains of sand upon the seashore. Therefore, unless God most precisely and perfectly foresees the future choices of human wills, all the prophecies he ever made, whether about David, Hezekiah, Josiah, Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, Alexander, the 4 great empires, or the many wars, upheavals, victories, blessings, and calamities of kingdoms and nations throughout history, would have been made without any true knowledge. According to the view that God does not foresee the volitions and free actions of men, he could predict nothing at all concerning the future state of mankind, not even the very existence of a single person in any coming generation. He could only foreknow those events he himself would directly bring to pass by an extraordinary act of his immediate power, or those things which would unfold in the material world by the laws of nature, in cases where those laws operate independently of human choices. In other words, God would be left like a highly skilled mathematician or astronomer, able to calculate with great precision the orbits of the planets and the grand movements of the physical universe. But if we look closer, even these predictions would not be absolute. For events that come about by God's special, miraculous intervention cannot be foreknown unless one also knows when such intervention will be required. But the need for such divine acts always arises from the state of the moral world, which must be foreseen for such interventions to be truly predicted. Thus, God could not certainly foresee the global flood, the call of Abraham, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the plagues on Egypt, or the redemption of Israel from slavery, the expulsion of the 7 nations of Canaan, or the bringing of Israel into their land, for all these are shown in Scripture to be linked with the moral and spiritual state of mankind. Nor could God foreknow the most fitting or appointed time for the day of judgment or the world's final conflagration, for even this is chiefly determined by the progress and condition of the moral world. Nor, secondly, under this supposition can we reasonably believe that God could certainly foresee what will happen even in the natural and material world, including those things which, in normal circumstances, could be calculated by a skilled astronomer. For the moral world is the ultimate purpose for which the natural world exists, and the course of events in nature is certainly subordinate to God's intentions for the moral world. Throughout history, God has found it necessary, because of the state of the moral world, to intervene and interrupt the natural order, pausing or redirecting the regular course of nature. Unless he can foresee human choices, and thus know something about the future state of the moral world, he cannot know whether he will need to intervene in the same way again, nor can he foresee when or how such intervention might become necessary. Corollary 1. From these considerations, it is clear that unless God foresees the choices of moral agents, the statement of the Apostle James cannot be true. Known unto God are all his works from the beginning of the world. Acts 15:18. Corollary 2. It also follows that unless God knows beforehand the choices of moral agents, all the prophecies of Scripture are based on nothing more than conjecture, a conjecture, in most cases, marked by the greatest uncertainty, as it would depend on a countless multitude of human choices, all of which, even to God, would be undetermined. Nevertheless, these prophecies are presented as absolute predictions, many of them with the strongest affirmations, and some even confirmed by the most solemn oaths. Corollary 3. It also follows that if God were ignorant of future choices, then Christ's words after many momentous predictions, words that depend on the moral actions of men, would be in vain. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. Matthew 24:35. Corollary 4. For the same reason, it would follow that God has in vain claimed his prophecies as evidence of his foreknowledge, as the sign of his deity and the unique glory that sets him apart from all others. See Isaiah 41:22-26, 43:9-10, 44:8, 45:21, 46:10, 48:14. Argument 2. If God does not foreknow the choices of moral agents, then he could not have foreknown the fall of mankind or of the angels, and thus could not have foreseen all the great events that followed from these falls, such as sending his Son into the world to die for sinners, and everything pertaining to the great work of redemption. This would include all the things done over 4,000 years before Christ came, preparing the way for his coming, and the incarnation, life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Christ, his enthronement as king over heaven and earth, angels and humanity, the establishment of his church and kingdom in this world, his appointment as judge of all, and even all that Satan would do in opposition to Christ's kingdom, as well as the great transactions of the final judgment, and more. If God were ignorant in this way, then the following scriptures, and others like them, would have no real meaning, or would even be false. He chose us in him before the foundation of the world, Ephesians 1:4. He was foreordained before the foundation of the world, 1 Peter 1:20. Who has saved us and called us with a holy calling, not according to our works, but according to his own purpose and grace, which was given us in Christ Jesus before the world began, 2 Timothy 1:9. The wisdom of God and redemption, according to the eternal purpose which he purposed in Christ Jesus, Ephesians 3:11. In hope of eternal life, which God, who cannot lie, promised before the world began, Titus 1:2. Those whom he foreknew, he also predestined. Romans 8:29. Elect, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father. 1 Peter 1:2. If God did not foreknow the fall of man, nor the redemption accomplished by Jesus Christ, nor the choices of humanity after the fall, then he could not have foreknown the saints in any sense, not as individuals, nor as communities or nations, neither by sovereign election, nor even by simple foresight of their virtue or good works, nor by any foreknowledge of anything concerning them related to their salvation, or any benefit they would receive from Christ, or any aspect of their relationship to the Redeemer. Argument 3. If we suppose that God is ignorant of the future choices of free agents, then it necessarily follows that, in many cases, God would truly regret what he has done, actually wishing he had acted differently, because the outcomes of the most significant matters, those involving his moral kingdom, would be uncertain and could turn out quite differently than he had anticipated. This would require us to take statements like Genesis 6:6, "The Lord repented that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart," and 1 Samuel 15:11 in their most literal sense, contradicting passages such as Numbers 23:19, "God is not a man, that he should repent," and 1 Samuel 15:29, "The strength of Israel will not lie nor repent, for he is not a man, that he should repent." In fact, this view would mean God is perpetually grieved at heart and endlessly disappointed in his governance of the world, subject to infinite, constant perplexity and frustration. But such a condition is not consistent with his title as God over all, blessed forever, which describes him as enjoying perfect, continual, unbroken peace and happiness as the supreme ruler over the universe. See Romans 1:25, 9-5, 2 Corinthians 11:31, 1 Timothy 6:15. Argument 4. Furthermore, this notion would also imply that, as God is constantly repenting of what he has done, he must likewise be constantly changing his mind and intentions regarding his future plans, altering his strategies, abandoning previous designs, and forming new ones. His purposes, even in the principal aspects of his grand design, such as the state of his moral kingdom, would always be vulnerable to failure due to lack of foresight. He would be continually having to patch and repair his plan as it goes off course because of the unpredictable choices of moral agents. Instead of being perfectly unchangeable, he would actually be the being most subject to endless acts of repentance and change of intention, more than anyone else, for the simple reason that his responsibilities encompass an infinitely greater number of uncertain and unpredictable matters. In such circumstances, he would spend all his time trying to fix broken links and repair the disordered framework of his creation as best he could. The Supreme Lord would then govern the world under truly miserable limitations, unable to anticipate crucial developments that might affect his system, developments for which, if only he had known, he could have made timely provision. There could be urgent necessity for him to make specific arrangements for some major events of enormous and lasting impact, but only realize this when it is already too late, wishing in vain he had known earlier. On these principles, it would be within man's power, by his intentions and actions, to thwart God's plans, force him to change his mind, cause him vexation, and plunge his government into confusion. But how can such notions be reconciled with reason, or with the testimony of Scripture? For the Word of God teaches that all God's works, all that he ever does, the whole design and unfolding of his actions, are perfectly before his eyes from the very beginning. Scripture affirms that whatever schemes and intentions may exist in the hearts of men, the counsel of the Lord shall stand, and the thoughts of his heart to all generations. Proverbs 19:21, Psalm 33:10-11, that what the Lord of hosts has purposed, none shall annul. Isaiah 14:27, that none can frustrate his purpose or even a single thought. Job 42:2, and that whatever God does shall be forever, nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. Ecclesiastes 3:14. The unchangeable character and permanence of God's purposes are explicitly linked to his foreknowledge, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, "My counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose." Isaiah 46:10. How do these truths align with Scripture's portrayal of God's immutability, which says he is without variation or shadow of turning, and especially that he is unchangeable in his purposes? "I am the Lord, I do not change, therefore you, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed." Malachi 3:6, see also Exodus 3:14. "I am that I am," and Job 23:13-14. He is of one mind, and who can turn him? What his soul desires, that he does. For he performs what is appointed for me. Argument 5. If the notion of God's ignorance of the future choices of moral agents is carefully examined, its consequences will show that, after making the world, God would have been at risk of being utterly frustrated in the purpose for which he created it, and similarly liable to be disappointed in every great work he has accomplished. Clearly, the moral world is the purpose for which the natural world exists. The rest of creation is but a house that God has built and furnished for moral beings. The good or evil state of this moral world depends on how those beings use their natural abilities, which in turn depends upon their choices of will. Therefore, if these choices are truly unpredictable to God, because they are contingent and subject to no kind of necessity, then the affairs of the moral world might go wrong to any imaginable extent, even to the point of total ruin. On such a view, it might literally be said, as when humanity became deeply corrupt before the flood, the Lord repented that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. In creating the universe, God could not know whether he would be so disappointed by its outcome that it would grieve him at his heart that he had made it at all. In fact, all of mankind fell into sin, and a great multitude of the angels rebelled. But how could God have known in advance that all would not fall? How could he know that, despite all efforts to redeem them, all of humanity, left to the freedom of their own wills, would not persist in their rebellion and become even more corrupt, as happened before the flood? According to the theory I am seeking to refute, neither the fall of man nor the fall of angels could have been foreseen, and so God must have been profoundly disappointed by these events. Thus, the entire plan for our redemption, the destruction of the devil's works by the Messiah, and all the mighty acts God has performed in pursuit of this design, would merely be the result of his own disappointment, attempts to repair, as best he could, a system that was originally perfect and altogether good, but has since been shattered and confounded by the free will of angels and men. And even now, under this view, God would still be at risk of a second total disappointment. He could not know whether his intentions in the incarnation, life, death, resurrection, and exaltation of his only begotten Son, and all the other great works done to restore the created order, would truly succeed, for this too would hinge on human will. After all, there has been a widespread and enduring apostasy throughout the Christian world, a falling away that, for many centuries, was worse than paganism. Without foreknowledge of human choices, how could God know if Christendom would ever recover from such apostasy? How could he predict when it would begin, since the Apostle Paul said it had already begun in his own day? How could God know how far it would go in that age? And if the gospel failed to reform the Jews, what assurance could there be that it would ever turn the Gentile nations from their entrenched heathenism? Yet, Scripture repeatedly presents God as the one who made all things for himself and for his own pleasure, and who will unfailingly achieve his purpose in creation and in all his works. As all things are from him, so also will all things ultimately be for him, and in the end it will be seen that he is the first and the last. As it is written in Revelation 21:6, he said to me, "It is done. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last." But such a vision is wholly at odds with any notion that God could be disappointed in all his works, or could fail in achieving any purpose he has undertaken. Section 12. God's absolute foreknowledge of the future choices of moral agents cannot be reconciled with the idea that those choices are so contingent as to be entirely without necessity. Having established that God possesses a certain and infallible foreknowledge of the voluntary acts of moral agents, I now proceed, in the second place, to show the consequence of this truth, namely, how it follows that these events must be necessary, with a necessity of connection or consequence. The leading Arminian theologians, so far as I have observed, deny this conclusion. They maintain that, even if such foreknowledge is admitted, it does not prove any necessity in the events foreknown. I ask, therefore, that this question be examined carefully and thoroughly. I am convinced that, upon detailed and honest consideration, it can be decisively determined whether this is the case or not. In order to consider this issue rightly, I would make the following observations. 1. It is entirely clear that, in the case of something whose existence is infallibly and unbreakably connected to something else that already does, or did, exist, the existence of that thing is itself necessary. Several points may be noted here. 1. As I have previously explained, regarding the nature of necessity, in the case of things past, their having existed is now necessary. Having already taken place, it is no longer possible for them to have been otherwise. It is now impossible that it should not be true that these things have happened. 2. If there truly is a divine foreknowledge of the choices of free agents, then that foreknowledge, by definition, is something that already exists, and has existed long since, and thus, its existence is now necessary. It is utterly impossible for it not to be, or ever to have been. 3. It is also obvious that whatever is indissolubly connected to something necessary, is itself necessary. Just as a proposition whose truth is inseparably joined to another necessary proposition must itself be necessarily true. To deny this would be a contradiction. It would amount to saying that the connection is unbreakable, and yet not unbreakable, but may be broken. If something's existence is inseparably connected to another thing whose existence is now necessary, yet itself is not necessary, then it is possible for it not to exist, despite the connection, which is plainly absurd. Whether this absurdity is not obvious, let the reader judge. 4. It is equally clear that, if there exists a complete, certain, and infallible foreknowledge of the future choices of moral agents, then there must be a certain, infallible, and unbreakable connection between those events and that foreknowledge. Therefore, by the principles already stated, these events themselves must be necessary, since they are inseparably connected with something whose existence is already settled and cannot be otherwise. To say that God's foreknowledge is certain and infallible, while at the same time claiming that the connection between that foreknowledge and the event itself is uncertain or breakable, is plainly absurd. To assert such a thing would be the same as saying there is no necessary connection between a fact being infallibly known and that fact actually being true. It is therefore perfectly demonstrable that, if there is any infallible knowledge of future choices, then those events are themselves necessary, or in other words, it is impossible that they should fail to come to pass. For if it were possible that the event might be otherwise, then it would also be possible that the proposition affirming its future occurrence might not be true at this moment. This would involve the absurdity that it is not impossible for a proposition, now infallibly known to be true, actually to lack all truth. 2. No future event can be certainly foreknown if its existence is contingent and entirely without necessity. This can be shown as follows. It is impossible for anything to be certainly known by any mind unless there is evidence for it. To suppose otherwise is a contradiction, for a thing is certainly known only when it is evident to the understanding, and for a thing to be evident means that the understanding perceives evidence of it. But no mind, whether created or uncreated, can perceive evidence where there is none, for that would be to perceive something that does not exist. Therefore, if there is a truth that is absolutely without evidence, it is absolutely unknowable, and to suppose it is known is a contradiction. If there is any future event whose existence is contingent and without necessity, then its future occurrence is absolutely without evidence. Any evidence for it would have to be either self-evidence or derived from proof. Something must either be evident in itself or be made evident by its connection to something else. But a future event whose existence is entirely without necessity can have neither kind of evidence. It cannot be self-evident, for that would require that we can see its reality now, either by its present existence or by the necessity of its nature, but both are contrary to the supposition. It is supposed that the thing does not yet exist, and that it is not by nature necessarily bound to exist in the future, so its future existence cannot be self-evident. Nor can there be proof or evidence in anything else, or in any connection to something else that is evident, for that too would contradict the assumption. For we are assuming there is nothing presently in existence with which the future contingent event is connected. Any such connection would destroy its pure contingency and introduce necessity. Thus, it is shown that there is, in the very nature of things, absolutely no evidence at all for the future existence of a purely contingent event. If any such event exists, neither self-evidence nor proof. Therefore, such a thing is not truly evident, and so cannot be seen to be evident. In other words, it cannot be known. Let us illustrate this with an example. Suppose that 5,760 years ago, there existed no being except God himself, and at that moment, this world, or some particular body or spirit, suddenly sprang out of nothing into existence, taking on a specific nature and form, entirely by chance, with no involvement from God or any other cause, and without any ground, reason, or connection to anything prior. If such a thing were supposed, then there could have been no evidence of this event beforehand. There was no evidence of it in the thing itself, for it did not yet exist. There was no evidence in anything else, for to have evidence in something else would be to have a connection to something else, but such a connection is contrary to the very supposition. There was no prior evidence that this thing would come to be, for, by the assumption, there was no reason for it to happen rather than for something else to happen, or rather than for nothing to happen at all. All things beforehand were exactly the same, equally balanced with respect to this and any other possible occurrence. There was no weight, no advantage or value tipping the scales in any direction, and therefore, nothing that could serve as evidence for any understanding. The thing was, in every respect, absolutely without evidence, and therefore absolutely unknowable. An increase in the power of understanding or the capacity to discern makes no progress whatsoever toward discovering signs or evidence of it, no matter how greatly the capacity is increased, even to infinity. The improvement of sight might help one perceive evidence that is very distant or deeply hidden, but it cannot help one see evidence where there is none at all. If sight were infinitely sharp and understanding infinitely great, it would allow one to see everything that exists, and to see it perfectly and easily, but it would not in any way help to discern evidence where there is none. On the contrary, the greater the understanding, the more certain it would be that no evidence exists. 3. To suppose that the future choices of moral agents are not necessary events, that is, to suppose that it is not impossible for them not to occur, and yet to claim that God certainly foreknows them and knows all things, is to assert that God's knowledge contradicts itself. For to say that God knows with perfect certainty, not mere conjecture, that something will infallibly come to pass, while also knowing that the very same thing is so contingent that it might possibly not occur, is to make his knowledge inconsistent. It is equivalent to saying that God knows a proposition to be certainly and infallibly true, while simultaneously knowing it to be only contingently and uncertainly true. If a future choice is so lacking in necessity that nothing prevents it from failing to occur, then the statement predicting its occurrence is equally uncertain. Nothing prevents its truth from failing. If God knows all things, then he knows this proposition is uncertain. But this is inconsistent with knowing it is infallibly true. Thus, it is impossible for God to know with absolute certainty that something will happen, while also knowing that it might not happen. If something is truly contingent, then God perceives and judges it as such, if he sees things as they truly are. If the event is not necessary, it is possible it may never come to pass. And if it is possible for it never to happen, God knows this possibility, that is, he knows that the statement declaring it will occur might not be true. To know this is to know that its truth is uncertain, which cannot be reconciled with knowing it as an absolute certainty. If choices are, in themselves, contingent and without necessity, then it is no sign of perfect knowledge in anyone to state with certainty that they will occur. On the contrary, such a declaration would signal ignorance or error, for it would mean mistaking what is inherently uncertain for something certain. To say that God might have mysterious ways of knowing contingent events, beyond our comprehension, is as unreasonable as saying that God might know contradictions to be true for all we know, or that he might know something to be both certain and not certain at the same time, simply because his knowledge is beyond our understanding. Corollary 1. From what has been said, it is clear that the absolute decrees of God are no more incompatible with human liberty, because of any necessity that follows from such decrees, than is God's absolute foreknowledge. For the connection between an event and certain foreknowledge is just as infallible and indissoluble as the connection between the event and an absolute decree. It is no more possible for the event to disagree with the decree than for it to disagree with absolute knowledge. The link between event and foreknowledge is perfectly complete, for by definition, the knowledge is perfectly certain and infallible. Thus, the certainty cannot be made greater, nor can the connection between what is known and knowledge itself be strengthened. Therefore, if a decree is added to foreknowledge, it does not make the connection any stronger or more certain. If it were otherwise, perfect knowledge could be made even more certain by adding a decree, contrary to the very idea of absolute, unsurpassable knowledge. There is just as much impossibility that things infallibly foreknown should fail to happen, or, in other words, just as great a necessity for their future existence, as if the event itself had already been written down and made known to all mankind throughout every previous age, with the most perfect and indissoluble connection imaginable between the writing and the thing written. In such a case, it would be just as impossible for the event not to occur as if it had already occurred, and a divine decree could not make an event any more certain or necessary than this. Therefore, if such foreknowledge truly exists, as has already been proved, then necessity of connection and consequence is in no way inconsistent with whatever liberty man or any other creature may possess. From this it also follows that absolute decrees, which do not increase this necessity, cannot be inconsistent with the liberty man enjoys merely because they make the decreed event necessary and utterly certain to happen. So, if absolute decrees are ever thought to be inconsistent with man's liberty as a moral agent, or his liberty in a state of probation, or any liberty whatsoever, it is not because of any necessity such decrees would introduce. Dr. Whitby maintains that there is a great difference between God's foreknowledge and his decrees, as far as the necessity of future events is concerned. In his Discourse on the 5 Points, page 474, etc., he writes, God's prescience has no influence at all on our actions. Should God, by immediate revelation, give me the knowledge of the event of any man's state or actions, would my knowledge of them have any influence upon his actions? Surely none at all. Our knowledge does not affect the things we know, to make them more certain or more fixed than they would otherwise be. Now, foreknowledge in God is knowledge. As therefore knowledge has no influence on things that are, so neither has foreknowledge on things that shall be. And consequently, the foreknowledge of any action that would be otherwise free, cannot alter or diminish that freedom. Whereas God's decree of election is powerful and active, and comprehends the preparation and exhibition of such means, as shall unfrustrably produce the end, hence God's prescience renders no actions necessary. To this, on page 473, he cites Origen, God's prescience is not the cause of things future, but their being future is the cause of God's prescience that they will be. And also LeBlanc, who says, this is the truest resolution of this difficulty, that prescience is not the cause that things are future, but their being future is the cause they are foreseen. Similarly, Dr. Clarke, in his demonstration of the being and attributes of God, pages 95 to 99, and the author of The Freedom of the Will, in God and Creation, make the same point, claiming that foreknowledge has no more influence on things known, to make them necessary, than does after knowledge. To all of this I reply, the argument that knowledge does not make the thing known necessary is irrelevant and does not in the least weaken the reasoning I have already presented. Whether foreknowledge is what causes the event to be necessary is beside the point. Infallible foreknowledge can demonstrate the necessity of the event foreknown, even if it is not what causes that necessity. If the foreknowledge is absolute, it proves that the event is necessary, or, in other words, that it is impossible for the event not to happen, whether this is due to a decree, or to something else, if such there be. As I have said before, it is absurd to maintain that a proposition can be certainly and infallibly known to be true, when in reality it might still turn out to be false. The entire apparent strength of this objection lies in the claim that, since foreknowledge does not cause an event to be necessary, in the way a decree does, it therefore cannot prove the necessity of that event, as a decree can. But this reasoning is groundless, since it assumes that nothing can demonstrate or be evidence for the necessity of a thing except what actively causes it to be necessary. This, however, is clearly not the case. Even if certain foreknowledge of a future event is not what makes it impossible for the event to fail to happen, it still can, and certainly does, prove that such impossibility exists, whatever its source may be. Even if foreknowledge is not the cause, but merely the result of this necessity, it can just as well prove that the necessity exists as if it were the cause. To reason from effect to cause is as legitimate as to reason from cause to effect. It is enough that something whose existence is infallibly foreknown cannot fail to exist, regardless of whether that impossibility comes from foreknowledge itself or precedes it. It is as obvious as anything can be, that something infallibly known to be true cannot turn out to be false. Therefore, it must be necessary that it comes to pass, whether this necessity is the result of foreknowledge or whether the foreknowledge is the result of the necessity. All certain knowledge, whether it is foreknowledge, after knowledge, or knowledge concurrent with the event, demonstrates that the thing known is now necessary in some way, or that it is now impossible for it to be otherwise than true. I readily grant that foreknowledge does not prove a thing to be necessary any more than after knowledge does. But certain, infallible after knowledge shows that it has become impossible for the proposition known to be false. In other words, the truth of the statement about what has already happened is now unavoidable. Likewise, certain foreknowledge proves that, at the moment of knowledge, it has already become impossible for the proposition about what will happen to be false. In both cases, the necessity of the truth, the present impossibility of the event not existing as stated, is the immediate basis of the certainty of knowledge. There can be no true certainty of knowledge without this. There must be certainty in the things themselves before they can be certainly known, or, in other words, known as certain. Certainty of knowledge is nothing more than recognizing or perceiving the certainty that exists in the things themselves. Therefore, there must be such certainty in things as the basis for the certainty of knowledge and to make it possible to know anything as truly certain. And this is nothing other than the necessity of the truth known, or the impossibility of its being otherwise, in other words, the strong and infallible connection between the subject and predicate of the proposition expressing that truth. All certainty of knowledge depends on perceiving the firmness of this connection. Thus, God's certain foreknowledge of any future event is his perception of the unbreakable and certain connection between the subject and predicate of the proposition asserting that event's future existence. The subject is the possible event, the predicate is its future occurrence. If the future occurrence is truly and unbreakably linked to that event, then the event's future existence is necessary. If God certainly knows the future existence of an event that is in reality wholly contingent and might not occur, then he perceives a strong connection where none exists between the subject and predicate, which is a contradiction. I agree with Dr. Whitby in this, that mere knowledge does not act upon the thing known to make it more certain or more future. Yet I maintain that knowledge always assumes and demonstrates the thing to be already both future and certain, that is, necessarily future. Knowledge of something as future presupposes that it is indeed future, and certain knowledge of something as future presupposes that its futurity is already certain before the knowledge itself. But there can be no such thing as a certainty about the future, prior to the certainty of knowledge, except this, that it is already impossible for the event not to occur, in other words, that the event is necessary. I want to add one more point. If, as these writers claim, God's foreknowledge is not the cause but the effect of the event's existence, this does not diminish the necessity of the event, rather, it demonstrates it even more clearly. For it shows that the existence of the event is so fixed and definite that, in effect, it is as if it had already occurred, for its future existence has already produced an effect, namely, prescience. The effect, God's knowledge, exists now, and since an effect presupposes and entirely depends on its cause, it is as if the future event, which is its cause, already existed. The effect is as firm and real as anything can be, since it already exists, but an effect cannot be more stable or certain than its cause, its foundation, its ground. The structure cannot be firmer than the bedrock on which it rests. To clarify this further, suppose the images in a mirror or a reflecting telescope are real effects of distant heavenly bodies, which they faithfully represent. If this is true, then as soon as these images have appeared in the telescope, it is utterly impossible for it not to be the case that they have existed. Their existence is now an absolute certainty. Because they are the genuine effects of those distant bodies, this certainty proves that the existence of the heavenly bodies themselves is just as real, just as infallible, just as necessary as the existence of the images, since the two are completely linked, cause to effect. Now imagine if future events could, in some way, exert a backward influence and produce effects before they actually come to pass, causing exact images of themselves in a mirror thousands of years ahead of their own existence, even throughout all past ages. If these images are true effects of those future realities, and are completely dependent on and connected to their causes, then the prior existence of these images makes their own occurrence utterly unchangeable. It becomes impossible for them not to have existed. And this, as before, demonstrates that the existence of the things which cause them is just as certain and necessary as the existence of the effects. It is just as impossible for them not to occur as if they already had, since their effects already have. And if, instead of images in a glass, we imagine these prior effects to be perfect ideas in the divine mind, existing there from all eternity, and just as truly and properly effects connected to their cause, the principle holds just as strongly. Another response sometimes offered by Arminians, to lessen the force of the argument from God's prescience against the true contingency of human choices, is this: when we speak of foreknowledge in God, we are not speaking with strict accuracy, for although God possesses the most perfect knowledge of all events from eternity to eternity, there is no such thing as before and after with God. He sees all things in one perfect, unchanging view, without any succession. To this I reply, 1. It has already been demonstrated that all certain knowledge establishes the necessity of the truth known, regardless of whether that knowledge is before, after, or simultaneous with the event. While it is true that there is no succession in God's knowledge, and the mode of His knowledge is ultimately beyond our comprehension, there is one thing we do know about it: God is never, at any moment past, present, or future, uncertain about any event. He always sees the existence of each thing as certain and infallible. And since God always perceives things as they actually are, there is, in reality, never anything truly contingent in such a way that it might fail to occur. If, strictly speaking, there is no foreknowledge in God, it is only because what is future for us is as present to God as if it had already happened. That is simply to say, for God, future events are always as clear, sure, and necessary as if they already existed. If there is never a moment when the existence of an event is not present to God, then it is never possible, at any time, for that event to fail to exist, just as if its existence were already realized. God's perfect, unchanging perception, His absence of succession in ideas or judgments, does not prevent Him from now, in the eternal present of His mind, having certain and perfect knowledge of moral actions which, to us, will not occur for 100 years. Indeed, the very objection presupposes this. Therefore, according to all previous reasoning, it must now be impossible for those moral actions not to occur. We know that God foreknows human choices in such a way that He can explicitly foretell them, causing them to be recorded, as Scripture testifies repeatedly. Therefore, the necessary connection between God's knowledge and the events known makes those events just as necessary as if God's knowledge were before them, in the same way that a written prediction is. If that knowledge is infallible, then the written prediction is infallible also. There is an indissoluble link between the prophecy and the event. And if so, it is impossible for the prediction and the event not to agree, which is simply to say, it is impossible for the event not to occur, thus, its occurrence is necessary. So, it is clear that God's lack of succession, His timeless knowledge, does not at all affect the necessity of the events He knows. 2. Far from weakening the argument for the impossibility of known future events failing to occur, this objection actually strengthens and clarifies the evidence already presented. 4. 1. The very reason God's knowledge is without succession is because it is absolutely perfect, possessing the highest possible degree of clarity and certainty. All things, whether past, present, or future, are seen by God with equal evidence and fullness. Future things are viewed with the same clarity as if they were already present. His knowledge is always absolutely perfect, and such constant perfection allows for no change and thus no succession. The actual occurrence of the event adds nothing to the certainty or clarity of God's knowledge. God calls the things that are not as though they were. For him, all things are as real as if they already existed. This is the very strength of the argument already made, that it is as impossible for these events to fail of existence as if they had already come to pass. Thus, this objection, rather than weakening the argument, actually displays it in the strongest possible light. For it assumes that the existence of future events is so present and clear to God that when they finally do occur, it does not in any way alter or improve his knowledge of them. 2. This objection is actually based on the unchangeableness of God's knowledge, for it is precisely the immutability of his knowledge that makes it without succession. But this directly and powerfully supports the very thing I have been insisting on, namely, that it is utterly impossible for events foreknown by God to fail to come to pass. For if such failure were possible, then a change in God's knowledge would be possible. If the event foreknown did not come to be as God expected, he would see it, and his mind would change, he would recognize his earlier mistake. In that case, there would be change and succession in his knowledge. But since God is unchangeable, and since it is infinitely impossible for his knowledge to change, it is, for the very same reason, infinitely impossible for the foreknown event to fail to exist, and that is to say it is necessary in the highest sense. Nothing is more impossible than that the unchanging God should be altered by the succession of time, he who embraces all things, from eternity to eternity, in one most perfect and unchanging vision, whose whole eternal existence is, in the words of Boethius, a life that is unending, holy, simultaneously, and perfectly possessed. Taken as a whole, I am confident in declaring that no theorem or proposition in geometry can be more rigorously demonstrated than this. God's certain foreknowledge of the choices of moral agents cannot be reconciled with the idea that those choices are utterly contingent, free from all necessity, and thus cannot be reconciled with the Arminian definition of liberty. Corollary 2. From this it follows that the Calvinist doctrine of God's absolute decrees does not entail any greater fatalism than is already implied by the views of the more consistent Arminian theologians who admit God's omniscience and universal foreknowledge. Thus, every objection they bring against Calvinism, accusing it of teaching something akin to Hobbes's necessity or the Stoic doctrine of fate, applies with equal force to their own doctrine. It is therefore not fitting for such divines to make such accusations against Calvinists on this point. Corollary 3. Thus, every argument advanced by Arminians who affirm God's omniscience, against the inability of unregenerate men to fulfill the conditions of salvation or to obey God's spiritual commands, and against the Calvinistic doctrine of effectual grace, on the grounds that these doctrines, though they do not suppose men to be coerced, yet place them under necessity, must fall away. Likewise, their objections to the necessity of human choices, which appeal to the reasonableness of God's commands, promises, and threats, or to the sincerity of his invitations and counsels, and all objections against any Calvinistic doctrine as incompatible with human liberty on the grounds that it infers necessity, must all be recognized as empty and unsubstantiated when coming from those who themselves hold to divine omniscience and foreknowledge. Such arguments are equally applicable to their own position as to that of the Calvinists. Section 13. Whether we regard the choices of moral agents as connected to something prior or as arising independently, they are, in either case, necessary in a way that completely undermines the Arminian conception of liberty. Every act of the will must either have a cause or not. If it has a cause, then, as has already been shown, it cannot be contingent, but is necessary, for every effect depends necessarily on its cause, whatever that cause may be. If the cause is the will itself, by means of previous acts of choosing and determining, then even so, the determined act must be a necessary effect. An act that is the determined result of a previous act, which serves as its cause, cannot resist the power of its cause, but must be wholly subject to its direction and command, just as the motions of our hands and feet are to the choices of the will. The acts of the will that are commanded by an antecedent choice are thus as passive and necessary in relation to that preceding choice as the members of the body are to the will that directs them. Therefore, if every free act of the will is determined by the will itself, that is, by some antecedent choice, then every such act is necessary, being fully subject to, and decisively fixed by, the prior act that causes it. Indeed, even the determining act itself must be determined and fixed by some earlier act if it, too, is to be considered a free and voluntary act, and thus, it also must be necessary. So, on this account, every free act of the will is necessary, and cannot be free unless it is necessary, for, by the Arminian understanding of liberty, an act cannot be free unless it is determined by the will, and this means determined by some previous choice, which, being its cause, makes it necessary. Yet they also claim that necessity and liberty are utterly incompatible. Thus, by their own system, the acts of the will cannot be free unless they are necessary, and yet cannot be free if they are necessary. But if we accept the other side of the dilemma, that the free acts of the will have no cause and are not connected to anything prior that could determine them, in order to preserve their absolute contingency, and if we allow that this is even possible, still this offers no solution for their position. For if volition occurs by pure chance, with no cause at all, then it is certain that no act of the will, no previous act of the soul, played any part in producing it. No determination or choice of the soul had any role in bringing it about. In such a scenario, the will or soul is simply the subject upon which something accidental has occurred, but it is not the cause. The will does not act in causing or determining, rather, it is purely passive, at least according to their own distinction between activity and passivity. In this case, contingency stands just as much in the way of the will's self-determination as any external cause would. And with respect to the will, it was necessary, and could not have been otherwise. To say it might have been otherwise if the will or soul had so pleased is to suggest that the act depends on a prior act of choice or inclination, but this is contrary to the supposition that it was wholly uncaused. That is, to say it could have been otherwise if its cause had so ordered it, does not fit with its having no cause or orderer at all. Whatever is not dependent on any free act of the soul must, as to the soul, be necessary, and whatever comes about without a cause depends on no free act of the soul, since, by definition, it depends on nothing and is connected to nothing. In this situation, the soul is necessarily subject to whatever accident brings to pass at any moment, just as the inert earth is necessarily subject to whatever happens to fall upon it. But this is contrary to the Arminian concept of liberty, which holds that the will has power to determine itself in its own acts, being wholly active in that determination, without passivity or subjection to necessity. So, contingency is a core part of the Arminian idea of liberty, and yet it actually stands in direct contradiction to it. I must point out here that the author of the essay on the freedom of the will in God and the creature, pages 76 to 77, writes, "The word chance always means something done without design. Chance and design stand in direct opposition to each other, and chance can never be properly applied to acts of the will, which is the spring of all design, and which designs to choose whatsoever it doth choose, whether there be any superior fitness in the thing which it chooses, or no. And it designs to determine itself to one thing, where two things, perfectly equal, are proposed, merely because it will." Yet this statement reveals a striking oversight. For if the will is the spring of all design, as he claims, then the will itself cannot always be the effect of design. There must be times when acts of the will occur without springing from any prior design, and so, by his own definition, these acts must come to pass by chance. And if the will designs to choose whatever it does choose, and designs to determine itself, as he says, then it must also design to determine all of its designs. But this logic inevitably leads us back through an endless sequence. Each design must be the effect of a preceding design, and that of another before it, and so on ad infinitum. The very first design must either arise from a prior design or come about by chance, by his own account. Here we encounter another dilemma regarding the connection between acts of the will and some prior cause. Either human liberty is compatible with the necessary connection of volitions to the understanding, and thus compatible with necessity, or it is not. The first alternative directly overturns the Arminian definition of liberty, which insists on freedom from all necessity. But if the second is chosen, and liberty is said to require freedom from any necessary connection of volition to the understanding, such that the will is free only if it can act without any restraint, limitation, or government by reason, then liberty consists, at least in part, in the ability and liability to act against the dictates of understanding. In that case, the more the soul is detached from reason and understanding in its actions, the greater its supposed liberty. But let us consider what this view truly entails, especially when it is realized in its perfection. A full and perfect liberty, then, would mean total freedom and readiness to act entirely at random, without any connection to, restraint by, or governance from any dictate of reason, or from anything apprehended, considered, or viewed by the understanding. This is taken as essential to the supposed sovereignty of the will over itself. Yet, what dignity or privilege can there be in being left to such wild contingency, being perpetually liable to act irrationally, and as much without the guidance of understanding as if we had none at all, or were as senseless as smoke driven by the wind?